gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Chairman, point of order.
The gentleman will state his point of order. It's not a proper point of order for today's hearing.
Well, that got us started again.
Gentleman is not recognized.
Chairman,
The
has the
Chairman, I
Please
make
allow
a
him to
point
speak.
of order
Gentleman
that
has
he's
the time.
badgering the witness.
He is not. Gentleman will continue.
A point of order, the committee is not in order, and the chairman is not in order.
That is not a point of order. The committee is in order. The gentleman has the time.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Gentleman will state a point of order.
What are the rules? What are the objections that we're able to make?
That is not a point of order. The
It is a
gentleman
point of
will
order. There's no
It
rules.
is not a point of order. The gentleman will continue. There is no decision to appeal. It was not a ruling on the motion. We will now hear from point of order.
Mr. Chairman, you can then not allow us to appeal the ruling.
Guys, let's stay low. Stay low, please.
I will parliamentary.
I will not recognize the parliamentary at this time.
Is this what we did to your staff, after pictures of other staff, and the members get dealt out of this whole hearing? For the next 4 hours, we try to overturn the results of an election with unelected people.
Guys.
The Judiciary Committee will please come to order, a quorum being present. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2 and House Rule 11, Clause 2, the Chair may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment for which a recorded vote for the ayes and nays are ordered. Today we meet to begin consideration of articles of impeachment against President Donald J. Trump. Although it is our custom to limit opening statements to the Chair and Ranking Member of the committee, as I informed the Ranking Member, I believe that for such an important and solemn occasion as this, it would be appropriate for all members to have an opportunity to make an opening statement. Before we begin, I want to note the absence of our colleague Ted Lieu, who required a medical procedure Monday evening and will be unable to attend this markup. I understand he is in good spirits and plans to be back at work next week. His statement will be made part of the record, and I know that all of my colleagues join me in wishing him a speedy recovery. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, we begin consideration of 2 articles of impeachment against President Donald J. Trump. The first article charges that the President used the powers of his public office to demand that a foreign government attack his political rivals. The second article charges that the President obstructed the congressional investigation into his conduct. Other presidents have resisted congressional oversight, but President Trump's stonewall was complete, absolute, and without precedent in American history. Taken together, the 2 articles charge President Trump with placing his private political interests above our national security, above our free and fair elections, and above our ability to hold public officials accountable. This committee now owes it to the American people to give these articles close attention and to describe their factual basis, meaning, and importance. I believe that 3 questions should frame our debate. First, does the evidence show clearly that the President committed these acts? Second, do they rise to the level of impeachable high crimes and misdemeanors? Third, what are the consequences for our national security, for the integrity of our elections, and for our country if we fail to act? To the first question, there can be no serious debate about what President Trump did. On July 25th of this year, when he spoke to President Zelensky of Ukraine by telephone, President Trump had the upper hand. Ukraine had been invaded by Russia. Zelensky had only recently been elected. He badly needed our help. He needed it in the form of military aid already appropriated by Congress because of our national security interests in Ukraine. And he needed help in the form of an Oval Office meeting so he could show the world that the United States stands with him against Russian aggression. President Trump should have focused on America's national security and on the interests of the American people on that call. Instead, he completely ignored them in order to push his own personal political interests. President Trump asked for a favor. He wanted Ukraine to announce 2 bogus investigations, one into former Vice President Biden, his leading opponent in the 2020 election, and another to advance a conspiracy theory that Ukraine, not Russia, attacked our elections in 2016. These were not legitimate requests. Neither was supported by the evidence. One investigation was designed to help President Trump conceal the truth about the 2016 election. The other was designed to help him gain an advantage in the 2020 campaign. Both were divorced from reality and from official U.S. policy. The evidence proves that these requests were not related to any real interest in rooting out corruption. President Trump eagerly does business with corrupt governments every day. The evidence shows that President Trump did not care if real investigations took place. A public announcement that the government of Ukraine was investigating his rivals would have been enough for him to release the aid, whether or not an actual investigation ever took place. After the call, President Trump ratcheted up the pressure. He dangled the offer of an Oval Office meeting. He withheld $391 million in military aid. His personal lawyer traveled to pressure the Ukrainians directly. The president deployed other agents, including outside the official channels of diplomacy, to make his desires clear. By September, President Zelensky was ready to comply, to announce the 2 fake investigations. Then the scandal broke into the open. Caught in the act, the president was forced to release the aid. When the House of Representatives opened an inquiry into the president's actions, President Trump did everything in his power to obstruct the investigation. He declared across-the-board resistance. He ordered every official in the federal government to defy all subpoenas related to the inquiry. At his command, the administration also refused to produce a single document related to the inquiry, not one. To put this obstruction into context, during the Watergate hearings, President Nixon turned over recordings of his conversations in the Oval Office. Later, President Clinton handed over his DNA. President Trump's obstruction was, by contrast, absolute. Those are the facts. They are overwhelming. There is no denying them. Having reviewed the evidence, we come to our second question. Is the president's proven conduct impeachable? The answer is simple. Absolutely. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, the president can be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. The highest of high crimes is abuse of power. It occurs when a president uses his official powers to serve his own personal selfish interests at the expense of the public good. To the founding generation that had fought a king and won our freedom, it was a specific, well-defined offense. The first article of impeachment charges President Trump with abuse of power. The article describes President Trump's conduct and lays out 2 aggravating factors that we must consider. In pressuring Ukraine for a personal favor, President Trump both betrayed our national security and attempted to corrupt our elections. When the president weakens an ally who advances American security interests by fighting an American adversary, the president weakens America. And when the president demands that a foreign government investigate his domestic political rivals, he corrupts our elections. To the founders, this kind of corruption was especially pernicious. Free and fair elections are the bedrock of our democracy. If our elections are corrupt, everything is corrupt. The President faces a second article of impeachment for his ongoing efforts to obstruct a lawful investigation into his conduct. We have never, in the history of our nation, seen a President categorically defy Congress in this manner. If the President can first abuse his power and then stonewall all congressional requests for information, Congress cannot fulfill its duty to act as a check and balance against the executive, and the President becomes a dictator. Later tonight, you will hear more about both articles and how they describe a pattern of behavior that President Trump seems determined to repeat again and again. My colleagues will also address various procedural objections that have been raised in the President's defense. But there is one of those objections that I wish to address right away. Some ask, why not take more time? Why is this necessary now? Why do we need to impeach the President? Why not let the next election handle it? This brings us to the third and final question. What is the risk if we do not act? Over the past 94 days since the House investigation began, indeed over the last 3 years, one indisputable truth has emerged. If we do not respond to President Trump's abuses of power, the abuses will continue. We cannot rely on an election to solve our problems when the President threatens the very integrity of that election. Nor can we sit on our hands while the President undermines our national security and while he allows his personal interests and the interests of our adversary, Russia, to advance. The President's personal lawyer was in Ukraine again just last week. That was not 3 years ago. That was not 3 months ago. That was Saturday. President Trump's continuing abuses of power jeopardize our security and our elections. The threat is urgent. If we do not act now, what happens next will be our responsibility as well as his. I will close with a word to my Republican colleagues. I know you. I have worked with many of you for years. I consider you to be good and decent public servants. I know this moment may be difficult, but you still have a choice. I hope every member of this committee will withstand the political pressures of the moment. I hope that none of us attempt to justify behavior that we know in our heart is wrong. I hope that we are able to work together to hold this president or any president accountable for breaking his most basic obligations to the country and to its citizens. And while you think about that choice, please keep in mind that, one way or the other, President Trump will not be president forever. When his time is past, when his grip on our politics is gone, when our country returns, as surely it will, to calmer times and stronger leadership, history will look back on our actions here today. How would you be remembered? We have each taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I hope to be remembered for honoring that oath. I hope you feel the same. And so, with a heavy heart, but clear in my duty to our country, I support these articles of impeachment. I urge my colleagues to support them as well. I yield back the balance of my time. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find it amazing at best, hilarious, I guess, at worst, that we come to quote a solemn and amazing moment. We've been on this path since November 2016. This is not new. We've been trying this for almost 3 years if you're a majority member of this party. The only thing that has changed is the opportunity from last November when you became the majority. The only thing that changed in your desire to impeach this president was that you became the majority. And we have spent all year in this committee trying to impeach the president. We have occasionally had markups on bills, most of which so partisan they cannot even go forward in the Senate, most of which that do not address any issue that we've talked about. But it is amazing to me that we're taking it now as such a solemn oath that we've made up something to now come to this point to say, this is very solemn, like it jumped up and snuck up on you. It's about like the holiday season. It doesn't jump up and sneak up on you when you've been expecting it the whole time. And that's what we've been doing. What has been amazing to me is some things that we have seen. So let's just take some perspective here for a little while. What has our committee, this great committee, come to? That's the question for us. Let's just take it for just a moment inside these impeachment hearings. This is our third. I'll count it into tomorrow for three. 3 hearings in this committee of impeachment, and that's all we're having. What did we get out of those 3 hearings? We had a bunch of law professors, 3 of which who cannot stand the president, who cannot stand his voters, and cannot stand the fact that he's still in office, telling us why he should be impeached, and that inferences were okay to find impeachment. We had a hearing just 2 days ago from staff lecturing us on what's relevant and not relevant, and what they found in a report, while the member that wrote the report hid in his closet somewhere, I guess, or in his office, not wanting to come face the questions of this committee. That should be abhorrent to everyone here. So let's think about what we've seen and what we've not seen. And again, Chairman Schiff is nowhere to be found. When we understand this, we look forward. Tonight it has started again. We talk about tearing down of national institutions, and we start talking about putting our security at risk, when tonight, even in the chairman's opening statement, we start with one of the most amazing takedowns I have ever seen. When they can't make their argument that the president pressured Mr. Zelensky, they then attack Mr. Zelensky and then say that he was pressured. When Mr. Zelensky on numerous occasions, he said, I have not been pressured, I'm not being used, the call was fine, I'm not being pressured to do anything, then here's what the majority is saying. The majority is saying Mr. Zelensky is a liar, and we in this body, the Democrats, are tearing down a world leader in the eyes of those that don't like him in his own country and Russia, who is attacking him. Think about that one for just a second. Let that sink in. When we can't make our case, we tear down, not only try to tear down the leader of the free world, President Trump, we're tearing down the newly elected leader of the Ukraine. This is amazing to me. You can't make your case against the president because nothing happened, and when President Zelensky confirms nothing happened, we start tearing him down. I never thought we would cross outside of the ocean to try and basically impugn the integrity of a world leader like we have been for the last 2 hearings. We have also found other things that we have found in our very minimal hearings here in this body is we have seen that other committees have used political vendettas against ranking members and others, including members of the press who are sitting here tonight, by putting phone records in, naming names. I mean, you talk about getting even. We put names, Mr. Nunez, Mr. Solomon, others, on those 4 numbers that we looked at. And nobody would own up to it. Mr. Goldman, Mr. Schiff, of course, wasn't here, but even Mr. Goldman wouldn't own up to who said to do that when they could have simply put in the record, Congressman 1, Congressman 2, reporter 1. No, they got what they wanted. They got their drive-by. They got their political smear. That's the record being built in Judiciary Committee. Not a record of facts against this president, a record of a Democratic Party who's lost all moorings of fairness and good taste. That's what we're seeing here. And we can have all the flowery opening statements tonight we want, but they can't get away from that fact. What is the big lie that is being perpetrated here on us? The big lie is this, and one of the Democrats have told the American people, they have said this for 3 years. The big lie that we're hearing perpetrated tonight is one, the end justifies the means. The lie is that the sham impeachment is okay because the threat is so real and so urgent and so imminent. The big lie is that political expediency is honorable and justifiable, and history has shown that to be untrue and dangerous. The big lie is that Adam Schiff had gained evidence in plain sight, he said, of President Trump colluding with Russia, and Special Counsel Mueller's report debunked that lie, but it continues to spread like a cancer every time we meet. The big lie is that the evidence is the impeachment of overwhelming and uncontested. The facts are undisputed. The very fact that people in this committee dispute the facts make them disputed facts, not undisputed facts. The problem that we're seeing here is when you even get to the articles themselves, abuse of power. When you look at these articles and compare them to history, I'm glad the chairman brought up history, because I would not write history. It will be written for us at a later time, because they will not always be the majority, as he talked about this president not always being president. I do believe he will be president for 5 more years. But at this time, there will be a turnover at some point. And what have we had? This is the articles that we wrote after all of these hearings and all these grand pronouncements and all these thoughts of crimes in plain sight. We get abuse of power with no real dates on this is the abuse. It's just generic, vague statements. You know why I believe that is? Is because the Democrats can't come up with the argument for it. They don't have the who knew it and when they knew it. All they have is, well, here, members, we're going to give you abuse of power. You go home, pick something you don't like about the president. There's your abuse of power. This is as much about political expediency as it is anything else, and that should never be in articles of impeachment. And anybody to defend that is treading on very thin ice. And then obstruction of Congress. You know, the only obstruction we've seen here is obstruction from Chairman Schiff of this investigation. He did not turn over the documents as he was supposed to. We get those last Saturday in a massive document up after we've already had a hearing, after we had getting ready for another hearing in which we were supposed to lay out the report. And tonight, he sends a letter of classified information that has been classified over to us tonight. Don't think for a second, American public, that this majority wants you to find the truth. The obstruction has only occurred from Adam Schiff and the HPSC and the majority, keeping people from actually trying to find the truth. That's the only obstruction here. So why don't we just have that as an obstruction charge? But it would be against Adam Schiff and the majority, not the president. 2 articles like that? Abuse of power and obstruction of Congress in 70-something days. The only abuse of power here is the majority racing the fastest they've ever had, the clock in the calendar determining what impeachment looks like. That's the abuse of power, as Professor Turley said. But before I finish, I cannot stop without this. The real legacy of this impeachment hearing will not be the removal of Donald Trump as president. In fact, if anything, they see the majority for what they are, on a 3-year vendetta to get someone that they couldn't beat, and they're desperate to do it before he beats them again next year. Here's the real damage. It's the institutional damage to this body. It's the institutional damage to getting information even after hearing started, for not having the rules followed, for having this committee, as the chairman warned us about 20 years ago when he said this great committee, the Judiciary Committee, should never accept a report from someone else without verifying it and having hearings to make sure it was there. Unless, as the chairman said, we become a rubber stamp. I don't know about you, but I'm not a rubber stamp, and I don't like what I have been forced to do. Sit here, be lectured to by law professors and a staff that does not wear a pen telling us what's relevant or not. We're a rubber stamp of the worst kind because we didn't even try to make a point. The minority hearing day, which, by the way, get ready, we'll talk about this more. We're going to talk about something tonight, and we'll get it shot down tomorrow, and Rules Committee will take care of it. But for reporters and for media and people who've watched this body and the institution that I've loved all of my life and watched it since I was an intern up here being destroyed day after day, if the minority has no rights, and one day this majority will be back in the minority, and they will be crying and screaming for minority rights to be upheld, and I will just point back to 2019 and say, this is the year you put a dagger in minority rights. Justify the most basic obligations of this committee have been overrun. So tonight we're in December. After a year of trashing this institution, a year of trying to trash this administration and this president, we come up with abuse of power and can't define it. We come up with obstruction of Congress after 72 days. I know they're desperate. You know how I know it? Adam Schiff's own words yesterday. We can't go to court. That would take too long. An election is coming. Let me finish the last part of that sentence, as he liked to put words into President Trump's mouth when he faked the call transcript. No, Adam, what you need to continue to say is, we can't beat him next year. The only thing we need is a 30-second commercial saying, we impeached him. That's the wrong reason to impeach somebody, and the American people are seeing through this. But at the end of the day, my heart breaks for a committee that has trashed this institution, and this is where we are now. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We will now proceed with 5-minute opening statements from other members of the committee. I now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lofgren, for 5 minutes.
This is a serious moment for our country. I've worked on presidential impeachments as part of this committee twice before, and a third time brings me no joy. Members of Congress all take an oath to uphold the Constitution. When the president violates the constitutional order, we have an obligation to live up to our oath of office to deal with that. Last week, this committee got direct evidence about the president's actions to threaten our national security, undermine the integrity of the next election, and his violation of his oath. As a staff member to my predecessor, Congressman Don Edwards, I watched his opening in the Nixon impeachment, and it rings true today. He said, "The value and beauty of our Constitution and representative government, if it's going to work, requires that we all respect and obey the Constitution. It's the compact we have with each other. Put simply, no one is above the law, and the President of the United States must follow the Constitution." President Trump has not only abused his power for the upcoming election, he used a foreign power to do it. George Washington would likely be astonished, since he warned against the insidious wiles of foreign influence. One of my most vivid memories of the 1974 impeachment was Representative Chuck Wiggins, one of the most vigorous defenders of President Nixon, when he realized that Nixon had lied to him. I've been waiting for Republican members here to have their Chuck Wiggins moment. But it seems like we live in an alternate reality, whereas one columnist recently said, "If it swims and quacks like a duck, it's a piano." It's understandable that Republicans feel loyalty to the leader of their party, but loyalty to our country and our Constitution must be greater. I've reviewed what Republican committee members said during the Nixon impeachment. Representative Larry Hogan said, "It's not easy for me to align myself against the president, to whom I gave my enthusiastic support, but I cannot in good conscience turn away from the evidence." Caldwell Butler, another pro-Nixon Republican, said, "The misuse of power is the very essence of tyranny, and that Nixon's lack of remorse for his misconduct and concern for his constitutional responsibility were a factor in his supporting impeachment." That is a problem today as well. President Trump continues his misconduct. He's not contrite. He poses an ongoing threat. Representative Butler said this about the Republicans: "It is we, not the Democrats, who must demonstrate that we are capable of enforcing the high standard." Where are the Caldwell Butlers and Larry Hogans of today in the Republican Party? What is before us is a serious abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, and I hope that every member here will vote their conscience. We are blessed to live in a wonderful, free country. An important thing that keeps us free is the Constitution of the United States and the generations of Americans who've defended that Constitution on the battlefield, in the courts, in the Congress. The founders included the impeachment clause in the Constitution purposefully, and they gave Congress the sole authority to impeach for a reason. If the president, who had been granted vast powers, abused that power, threatened the constitutional order, then Congress could and should act to try to curb that abuse. It is the foundation of our free society. The power to impeach is not to punish a president. It is to protect Americans from a president who would abuse his power, upend the constitutional order, and threaten our democracy. Regrettably, President Trump has engaged in the abuse of power. His failure does not permit us to fail to fulfill our oath. It is with considerable regret that I find our country faced with the need to impeach President Trump for his abuse of power. But the future of our democracy and constitutional order require it, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with everybody that tonight is a very solemn night. This is the third time in the last 40 years, 45 years, that this committee has sat to debate articles of impeachment against the President of the United States. What we're debating here, in my opinion, is the weakest case in history. And yet the Democrats have decided to go full speed ahead, again because of the clock and the calendar, with an incomplete record simply by using hearsay evidence and trashing the rules of the House every time they can in order to speed things up for the preordained conclusion, and that is a partisan vote for impeachment, something that both the Speaker and the Chairman of this committee rejected earlier on when they thought they could make this bipartisan. If they could have made it bipartisan, they blew their opportunity very early on with their trashing of the rules and the trashing of what is in the history of this committee. Now let's look at these two articles. Unlike the Nixon and Clinton impeachment, there is no crime that is alleged to have been committed by the President of the United States. There are policy differences, but I would submit that given the definition of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors, that does not mean that policy differences should be enough to remove a president from office. There's no allegation of bribery in these articles. There's no allegation of extortion. They have defined for themselves what a high crime and misdemeanor will be. This bar is so low that what is happening is that a future president can be impeached for any disagreement when the presidency and the House of Representatives are controlled by different parties. And that goes back to establishing a parliamentary system, which the framers explicitly rejected at the time of the Constitutional Convention. In the United Kingdom or Canada or other parliamentary democracies, if the government loses the confidence of a majority of the lower house, the government's out, and there either is a new government or a new election that happens. The framers didn't want that. We had an independent presidency. The president was independently elected. He did not serve at the sufferance of Congress. He served for a fixed term. And it was only if he really obstructed the functions of government or was treasonous, he could be impeached. Now let's look at obstruction of Congress. Again, in the past, whenever the executive and legislative branches in the United States have had a disagreement, they've gone to court, and the third branch decides this difference. This committee and this majority are so hidebound to their clock and their calendar that they will not allow the judicial process to work out. What brought Richard Nixon down, honestly, was the Supreme Court saying that he had to turn over certain documents. And within 2 or 3 weeks after that, the president knew his time was up. There were Republicans that convinced him of that, and he resigned, mooting out the impeachment. So yes, the Constitution is at stake. The framers of our Constitution's enlightened decisions are at stake. We are not to go on a road to becoming a parliamentary democracy like England and Canada are. We need an independent president who does not have to suffer to anything a congressional majority might throw at him. That's what the courts are for, to figure it out. And I would appeal to my chairman, the majority members of this committee, to listen to what Madison and Hamilton had to say during the ratification of the Constitution and during the debates at the convention. Put aside your partisan politics and don't listen to what Pelosi, Schiff, and Nadler are telling you, because the future of our country and the viability of our Constitution, as the framers decided, are at stake. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Constitution begins with we, the people of the United States, among other things, promote the general welfare and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, perpetrated constitutional crimes. Why does this matter today, now in this moment of the journey of America's history? Because truth matters, and where truth rests, trust builds. The Constitution is a plain language set of laws that Americans for generations have adhered to and been protected by. It is a list of crimes the framers feared and are forbidden actions not to be taken by our governors. The Founding Fathers believed the Bill of Rights is a living document, freedom of speech and privacy, ending slavery. So today my case will rest on truth and trust. I will ignore the politics of impeachment, but rather the facts and truth I must abide by. The Congress has the power to impeach the President. The President can be impeached and removed from office for the convictions of treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors. This is the law of the land. So here are the facts. First, President Trump violated his oath of office by placing his personal and political interests above the national interest by scheming to get Ukraine to investigate a potential election opponent. Second, President Trump betrayed the national interest by withholding vital congressionally appropriated security to a beleaguered and besieged ally facing armed aggression from Russia, America's implacable foe. Third, the essential purpose of the scheme concocted by President Trump was to enlist a foreign country to help him fix the 2020 presidential election in his favor, the very type of interference our framers most feared. And then he blocked witnesses and documents obstructing Congress. These acts are precise and evidence-based and must stand the test of truth and trust in a Constitution that has been the foundation of this nation for centuries. The truth is, this president did ask for a favor, though. Witnesses under oath swore to that. The truth is, $391 million was withheld. The truth is, the only goal of the president's acts harmed the American people, violated his oath, and promoted his 2020 election. Now, truth raises the question again. Did the president follow his oath? Another sacred duty, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, that the law saved a besieged small nation those monies that were needed by Ukraine. Many lives during that time of delay were lost in a country fighting for its survival. Yes. And was America's national security in jeopardy? Yes. The bright light of this constitutional democracy dimmed because of his acts. The truth is no longer for all. It is for one man, Donald J. Trump, his truth, his way. We must reject that abuse of power because this is not America. No one is above the law. Reminded of my grandfather who left his native land to join with his wife and to bring his aspirations and hopes to the United States. I'm reminded that he died an early death because of lack of access to health care, but yet I'm told he was still inspired by this nation. And I'm reminded that my widowed grandmother watched Eric, Alan, and Samuel go off to war in World War II. These are America's stories, families who believe, and when the commander-in-chief violates his oath and abuses power, corrupts our democracy, it is a continuing threat to our national security. The truth is, it becomes like the leaves on a tree. It falls to the ground, and the trust that is a cornerstone of our democracy shakes in the stare of a government no longer for the people and by the people, but a government led by a president who undermines our democracy over and over again, and even looking forward to interfering with our election in 2020. It matters to the waitress on an early bus for the breakfast shift. It matters to the steel worker helping to build America. It matters to the teacher in our 5th grade social studies class. It matters to a mother kissing her young military recruit before they go off to their service to this nation. It is important that we begin to understand that we cannot be stopped by distractions. This must be the time when we rise and sacrifice so that the wheels of justice turn toward right. Our sacrifice is unselfish. Our truth will set this nation free. For this reason, I vote aye and must vote aye on the articles of impeachment, Article 1 and Article 2. For his truth is marching on. His truth is marching on. Impeachment cannot be warped by equivocation wrapped in doubt. It must be done both by the past and present. And the question is, the America that we know and love, can it survive the pillars of abuse? No, it cannot. And that is why I put my faith in trust and truth. And that is why we stand tonight for America's future. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Shabbat.
Mr. Chairman, as we consider this evening articles of impeachment that, if adopted by this committee, the full House, and God forbid, garners a 2/3 vote in the Senate, would result in the overturning of a presidential election, it seems appropriate to consider how in the world we got here. We are witnessing, I believe, the most tragic mockery of justice in the history of this nation. We are witnessing an inexplicable rush to impeach a president who is disliked, no, loathed by most of my Democratic colleagues and by their supporters, and as a result of that loathing, they see fit to abandon all basic tenets of fairness, due process, and justice guaranteed to every American under the Constitution. After the farce in the Intelligence Committee, we had dumped in our laps a report recommending impeachment with no time to adequately consider or review the materials. So much for the rules allowing members of the Judiciary Committee, or any committee for that matter, to responsibly consider such materials, especially if they're involving something as important as the impeachment and potential removal of the President of the United States. The report from the Intelligence Committee was based largely on testimony taken in secret depositions in the basement of the Capitol building, which was closed to most members of Congress, closed to the media, and closed to the American people. If that's not bad enough, the report scandalously published the phone records of the President's personal attorney, a member of the media, and a fellow member of this body. Under what legal authority these phone records were obtained, we have no idea. Then last Wednesday, this committee, the committee actually charged with handling impeachment, held the first of two hearings in which we heard from exactly 0 fact witnesses. On Saturday, the Democrats on this committee announced that they had, without precedent, changed the requirements for impeachment so that the commission of an actual crime would no longer be necessary to satisfy the standard of high crimes and misdemeanors. And they announced that the president would not be permitted to present a case in his own defense. Every school child in America knows that it is improper and unfair to change the rules in the middle of the game, Mr. Chairman. It's an ex post facto law and forbidden under the Constitution. The flaunting of the law by the majority on this committee has been breathtaking. This past Monday, during our second hearing, again without any fact witnesses, we had the bizarre situation in which rather than members questioning witnesses, we had staff questioning staff, and even had a staff witness get up from the witness stand down there, walk over to this dais, and begin questioning another staff witness. At the same time, Republicans on this committee were denied the absolute right to have a minority hearing day, which is guaranteed by this committee's own rules. The chairman of this committee and the majority have seen fit to abuse this committee's rules and ignore the rights of the minority with impunity. The majority should keep in mind that they will one day be in the minority, and they are setting a precedent in which they will likely one day be the victim themselves. Now we're debating articles of impeachment drafted by the majority on this committee, really by Nancy Pelosi and her cohorts, without any consultation with the minority party and based on what constitutional scholar Jonathan Turley called wafer-thin evidence. Tomorrow, this committee will hold a vote to impeach a president without having heard from a single fact witness and without allowing the minority party the ability to call any witnesses or present any defense. What a travesty of justice. In summary, over the last few weeks, House Democrats have either actively participated in or acquiesced to the drafting of impeachment articles based solely on evidence collected in secret hearings closed to the media and to the American people. Constitutionally prohibited ex post facto rules were welcome. The President's Fourth Amendment rights under the Constitution were ignored. The President's due process rights under the Fifth Amendment and his right to face his accusers and present a defense under the Sixth Amendment were also totally ignored. If George Orwell had written the script, no one would have believed it. People would say that it's ridiculously implausible, and yet here we are. To satisfy their base's extreme hatred of President Trump, House Democrats have taken a blowtorch to House rules, the rule of law, and most frighteningly, to the Bill of Rights. This is a sad day in American history, Mr. Chairman. The folks in the liberal media might be cheering you on, but I highly doubt that either history or the American people will judge you so leniently. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our Constitution embodies our values and laws and invests the power of our government in the authority of the people, expressed through free and fair elections. When President Trump, for his own personal political gain, asked for a favor from a foreign leader, he did exactly what our founding fathers feared most. He invited the influence of a foreign power into our elections. This is one of the primary reasons the founders placed impeachment in our Constitution. Last week, Professor Carlin summed up his wrongdoing well when she stated, quote, "When President Trump invited, indeed demanded, foreign involvement in our upcoming election, he struck at the very heart of what makes this country the republic to which we pledge allegiance. That demand constituted an abuse of power." She continued on, "Drawing a foreign government into our election process is an especially serious abuse of power because it undermines democracy itself." It's as if our founders could see into 2019, and when they did, they saw Donald Trump corrupting our democracy by saying to President Zelensky of Ukraine, "I'd like you to do us a favor, though." President Trump's subversive and illegal action in seeking foreign interference are an effrontery to our Constitution and to free and fair elections. They are an affront to our founders. They are an affront to the suffragists who fought for women's voting rights. They are an affront to the memory of Medgar Evers, a civil rights leader assassinated in Jackson, Mississippi. They are an affront to the memories of Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, civil rights workers murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi during the Freedom Summer of '64 while registering African Americans to vote. They are an affront to the memory of Viola Liuzzo, a mother of 5 who was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan while she was in Alabama to participate in the Selma to Montgomery March. And they're an affront to the memory of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who championed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And they're an affront to every service member who has ever fought to defend our nation and our system of self-government, which is based upon free and fair elections. President Trump's attempt to subvert our election was an attack on America. The president got caught when the whistleblower exposed the president's scheme. Then the president sought to cover up the scheme. He stonewalled Congress as we pursued our investigation. He instructed his staff, cabinet, and other federal officials to do the same. Previous presidents facing impeachment, even President Nixon, cooperated with Congress. But President Trump has thumbed his nose at constitutional power, and he refused to appear to defend himself. Congress is a co-equal branch of government and was foremost to the founders' minds. They placed Congress first in Article 1 of the Constitution. President Trump's obstruction of Congress is an affront to Peter Rodino, who chaired this committee in the summer of '74 when Congress investigated Nixon's betrayal of his oath of office. It's also an affront to the memory of Representative Barbara Jordan, who as a member of this committee said she would not, quote, "be an idle spectator to the diminution, the subversion, the destruction of the Constitution." And it's an affront to the memory of Congressman Elijah Cummings, who knew we were better than this. And it's an affront to the many patriots who love this country enough to defy the president's tyrannical attempt to prohibit their testimony, including Ambassador Yovanovitch, Ambassador Taylor, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, and Dr. Fiona Hill. And further, it's an affront to the memory of Caldwell Butler, a principled Republican of the Judiciary Committee in 1974. He did not support impeachment before the hearings, but he listened to the evidence, and that convinced him. He announced he would vote for impeachment by saying, "For years, we Republicans have campaigned against corruption and misconduct, but Watergate is our shame." His sense of right and wrong was inviolate. When his mother warned him that his future would go, quote, "down the drain," unquote, he responded, "Dear mother, you are probably right. However, I feel that my loyalty to the Republican Party does not relieve me of the obligation that I have." His mother was wrong. Representative Butler served for another decade. And President Trump's obstruction of Congress is an affront to the citizens of my district, all members of Congress, and all Americans who support free and fair elections. We, the People's House, have a duty to uphold our oath of office and to be a check on a president who abuses his power, betrays his oath, and corrupts our elections. Those who want to turn a blind eye to President Trump corrupting our democracy will try to get us to look away. We should not look away. I will not look away. I will remember our founders' great plan for our great nation, and I will remember the rule of law. Above all, I will adhere to my oath of office. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Gohmert.
This is truly a sad day for America. It's a sad week for America. You want to know where the Hogans and Butlers are? They're right here. There are people here willing to vote against our president. But a funny thing happened on the way to this hearing. We just got a report from Obama's Inspector General, and his report confirms what we had a feeling was true, but we were willing to wait and hear what the truth was, and that is the president nor his campaign committed any crimes. For 3 years, we've heard from people that are now in the majority talk about the crimes of the president. And where are they? Well, they kept saying, Mr. President, come.
Times President Zelensky has had to say that. Apparently, it's not enough because minds on the other side of the aisle are closed. But that's what the facts are. And the facts, again, speak for themselves. There was no impeachable offense here. And that's why Article 1 of the impeachments ended up falling flat on its face, and that it should be stricken, and I support the amendment to strike it from the gentleman of Ohio and yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady.
I yield to the gentleman from
18 seconds
Georgia.
The gentleman is recognized.
Okay,
15 seconds.
real quick, also, Ken Starr sent those over before the hearings began too, correct? They didn't.
Yes.
We didn't get a letter in the middle of hearings saying, oh, by the way, we just got a document dump on the weekend, and where the chairman told me, well, we're not going to be able to read them anyway.
No, we got him,
Gentleman's
and
time
it
is
was a
expired.
surprise.
Gentleman's time is expired. For what purpose does Jackson Lee seek recognition?
I just strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I think before I begin to comment on the discussion here, that it is important to remind all of us that the president abuses power and is a continuing threat not only to democracy but to our national security. We do not take this lightly. We take it very seriously. And I beg to differ with my dear friend. As one who was here for the impeachment proceedings in 1998, along with my colleagues, both Mr. Sensenbrenner, Mr. Chabot, Mr. Nadler, Ms. Loughran, let me be very clear of the distinctive difference that we had then at that time. For the American people, the special prosecutor was an independent statute that allowed both Mr. Jaworski during the Nixon impeachment proceedings and then Mr. Starr to have an independent process of investigation. The Congress was not privy to any of that investigation at all. They proceeded. They were not interfered with, as Mr. Mueller was, by the DOJ, because he was an employee of the Department of Justice. And his employer, his boss, came out and characterized his report before he could even discuss it. In the instance of the proceedings of 1998, the Congress received a report, just as both our friends on the other side of the aisle and we, in the majority, received reports from the impeachment inquiry committees, who were investigatory committees. They did their work, yes, in a classified setting, as I imagine both Mr. Starr and Mr. Jaworski had to do in certain instances. They were like prosecutors. They had witnesses that were not in the public. And then, of course, there were full public hearings, 17 witnesses, first-hand witnesses who heard the call and testified not on any second-hand knowledge, but first-hand knowledge. It is clear that we're dealing with a question of a continuing threat, which is why we have to respond. And let me be very clear. I hold in my hands that unclassified transcript. I beg to differ with my friends. Allow me just for a moment to tell you that in the call, President Zelensky said these sentences. I would also like to thank you for your great support in the area of defense. We're trying to continue to cooperate for the next steps. Specifically, we also want to be ready to buy javelins. That's equipment, military equipment from the United States for defense purposes. Ukraine, in the midst of a war against a nation that shot down at least some of those alleged to be separatists using Russian weapons, a commercial airliner. This is a serious war where our men and women with military and in the military are on the ground trying to assist. And here's the very next sentence. The very next sentence is not, yes, let's get with the Department of Defense. Let's review your request. The very next sentence, I would like you to do a favor, though. This is a discussion about defense. The next sentence should have been, I think we are well aware of your difficult predicament. I'm going to have you talk to the Secretary of Defense, but it said a couple of sentences later, I would like to have the Attorney General call you or your people, and I'd like you to get to the bottom of it, investigation. So I would just offer to say that it is not frivolous and without facts that we proceed. We proceed with facts, and we take this in a very somber manner.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I'd be happy to yield to the gentlelady for a moment.
I would just like to note that while this aid was being withheld, people died. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put into the record an article from the Los Angeles Times entitled, "Trump Froze Military Aid as Ukrainian Soldiers Perished in Battle."
Without objection.
And note also that the highest death toll on any day in the Ukraine-Russian war was August 7th of this year, while aid was being withheld. So this had life and death consequences, and I yield back to the gentleman.
Very quickly, let me say my predecessor, Barbara Jordan, said that impeachment is designed for the president and his high ministers somehow to be called into account. That is all we're doing on behalf of the American people and protecting the national security of this nation. I yield back.
The
Mr. Chairman,
gentlelady yields
Mr.
back.
Chairman.
What purpose does Mr. Shabbat
strike the last word.
Gentleman strikes the last word. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the ranking member.
Yeah, just real quickly, the gentlelady from California just misstated something that I addressed head-on last night. And Undersecretary Hale stated this was prospective money. It was not interfering. It was not dealing with the issue that's going on now. You're in a war. For those of us who've actually been in a war zone, people do die in a war zone. This money did not stop that. That is something that cannot continue to be perpetrated upon this world. I yield back to Mr.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman, the biggest difference in the Clinton impeachment and this one is that President Clinton committed a crime, perjury. This president isn't even accused of committing a crime. The Constitution is pretty clear on what constitutes an impeachable offense: treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. It's not treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors, or whatever else Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff deem impeachable. Now, I think we can all agree that no president should abuse the powers of his or her office, just like the chairman of a House committee shouldn't abuse the powers of his office to obtain and publish the phone records of the president's personal attorney, a member of the media, and the ranking member of that same committee. But that doesn't make alleged abuse of power a high crime or misdemeanor. In their newly authored memo on constitutional grounds for impeachment, the majority on this committee goes to great lengths to explain why abuse of power is an impeachable offense, specifically mentioning it was one of the charges against both Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton. What they don't mention is that the House of Representatives has never adopted alleged abuse of power as a charge in a presidential impeachment. Why? Because there's no criminal statute describing what alleged abuse of power actually is. Abuse of power is therefore a vague, ambiguous term open to the interpretation of every individual. Because abuse of power lacks a concise legal definition, there's a higher burden of proof on those pursuing such a charge to show the actions of the president rise to the level of impeachment. I believed that Bill Clinton had abused the power of his office, but we failed to convince our colleagues in the House, and that particular charge was rejected by the full House. In this case, the evidence provided is less convincing. In fact, I'd argue it's non-existent. First, there was no quid pro quo. Second, it's a widely known fact that Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries on the planet. It's why Congress required the administration to certify that the Ukrainian government had taken steps to clean up corruption before military aid could be provided to the country. President Trump was well aware of that fact and quite skeptical of giving Ukraine foreign aid long before the now famous July 25th phone call. Third, Ukraine actually received the aid after the president was satisfied that Ukraine had taken meaningful steps to address corruption, which again is an obligation required by law. Based on the actual facts of this case, as opposed to the hearsay and innuendo compiled by the Intelligence Committee, it's clear that no abuse of power ever took place and there certainly isn't enough evidence to support an article of impeachment. Mr. Chairman, as you well know, there's another significant difference between the abuse of power charges against Nixon and Clinton and those presented here. In the Nixon and Clinton impeachments, abuse of power was a tacked-on charge, far less important in those cases than the actual high crimes charged against both of them. Here, it's the main thrust of the House Democrats' entire case. Let me put it another way. The entire argument for impeachment in this case is based on a charge that is not a crime, much less a high crime, and that has never been approved by the House of Representatives in a presidential impeachment before, ever in history. If that's the best you got, you wasted a whole lot of time and taxpayer dollars, all because so many of you, Mr. Chairman, hate this president. And one last thing. I guess we now know why Nancy Pelosi was focus grouping bribery as a potential charge, because she was desperately searching for a crime, any crime, to justify this sham impeachment. But that effort was abandoned because she knows, most members of Congress know, and now the American people know, there simply wasn't a crime committed here, and there shouldn't be an impeachment here either. I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield
Mr.
for
Chairman.
question?
Gentleman yielded back.
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does Mr. Swalwell seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
There are no crimes here. That is the defense my colleagues across the aisle are putting forward. How about the highest crime that one who holds public office could commit? A crime against our Constitution. After all, the Constitution is the highest, most supreme law of the land. Every other law, statutory laws included, derive from the Constitution, not the other way around. The President committed the highest crime against the Constitution by abusing his office, cheating in an election, inviting foreign interference for a purely personal gain, while jeopardizing our national security and the integrity of our elections. Now, the Constitution does not require President Trump have committed statutory crimes. After all, we in Congress are not criminal prosecutors. We do not prosecute crimes, we protect the Constitution. But since my colleagues keep bringing up what potential crimes a criminal prosecutor could charge the president with, let's go through some of them, because President Trump's conduct overlaps with criminal acts. Let's start with criminal bribery. 18 U.S. Code 201B2A. Relevant here, criminal bribery occurs when a public official demands or seeks anything of value personally in return for being influenced in the performance of an official act. Additionally, the public official must carry out these acts corruptly. Demands or seeks. President Trump demanded and sought the announcement and conduct of politically motivated investigations by President Zelensky. Anything of value personally. For the purposes of anti-bribery law, the phrase anything of value has been interpreted by the courts broadly to carry out the congressional purpose of punishing the abuse of public office. In return for being influenced, the third requirement. As the Intel Committee report demonstrated, President Trump sought an announcement of these investigations in return for performing two official acts. First, he conditioned release of vital military assistance on President Zelensky's investigations. And second, he conditioned a head of state meeting on these investigations. Fourth, performance of an official act. The courts have defined an official act as any decision or action, matter, cause, suit, proceeding, or controversy that may be pending or brought before a public official. Both of the acts in question, the military aid and the White House meeting, meet this requirement. Finally, corruptly. President Trump behaved corruptly throughout this course of conduct because he used his official office in exchange to seek a private benefit. A second crime, honest services fraud. 18 U.S. Code, Section 1346. President Trump knowingly and willfully orchestrated a scheme to defraud the American people of his honest services as President of the United States. This has been aligned often in the courts with bribery, except it also includes using a wire communication. Clearly, the July 25...
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
I will not yield. Clearly, the July 25 phone call constitutes a wire communication. So there you have it. At least 2 criminal statutory crimes. However, all of these conversations about statutory crimes are moot because the President of the United States refuses to allow his own Department of Justice to indict him. So the President may be charged with crimes statutorily one day, but that's not what we're doing here on this day. And we are not restricted like the Department of Justice is. So we will uphold our duty to charge the President with the crimes against the Constitution that he has committed, using your taxpayer dollars, jeopardizing the integrity of your vote for a purely political purpose and a purely personal gain. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back. And I would yield to the gentlelady from California.
I appreciate the gentleman's recitation of that fact. As a former prosecutor, you speak with tremendous authority. I would just like to note that the argument that somehow lying about a sexual affair is an abuse of presidential power, but the misuse of presidential power to get a benefit somehow doesn't matter. If it's lying about sex, we could put Stormy Daniels' case ahead of us. We don't believe that's a high crime and misdemeanor.
Yield.
No, and it is not before us, and it should not be for us, because it's not an abuse of presidential power. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does Mr. Gohmert seek recognition?
I rise in support of the amendment.
Gentleman, yield briefly.
The gentleman has the time. Does the gentleman wish to yield to Mr.
Will the gentleman yield briefly?
Yes.
The important thing is that Bill Clinton lied to a grand jury. That is a crime. The article of impeachment that passed the House accused Bill Clinton of lying to a grand jury, a crime and something that obstructs the ability of the courts to get to the truth. This is not what is happening here. Big difference.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time.
Gentleman reclaims his time.
It is interesting, though. We're here because of fraud, not by the president, but from within the Department of Justice. And I realize people on the other side of the aisle have been so busy trying to find some kind of charge, criminal charge to bring against the president, none of which worked, that they may not have been aware of the most recent Horowitz report. But it is clear now, that the whole investigation that has brought us here with crime after crime being alleged and then having to be dropped was a fraudulent effort before the FISA court to have a surveillance warrant done against Carter Page. They lied initially, said that he was a Russian agent when actually he had been used by the CIA as a spy against Russia. And so they lied, it was fraudulent, and there hopefully will be people that will answer for their crimes and their fraud in the Department of Justice in the days to come, and it sounds like that should be the case. And there was fraud all the way through, but for 3 years we had been hearing about the crimes of the candidate Trump and then the crimes of President Trump, and we come now today based on the initial fraud that got this whole impeachment stuff started, and no one on the other side is willing to acknowledge the fraud that brought us here, nor the fact that so many people here have been screaming about the president's crimes, and we're even hearing today, like we just did, oh yes, there were crimes. Well, then why aren't they in this impeachment document? It's because they don't exist. They've been disproven over and over and over again, and that's why the gentleman's amendment is so well taken. You don't want to go down this ground. I think it's a bad idea when it was proposed before. High crimes and misdemeanors, if it's not treason, right? Even misdemeanors are crimes. And so we've had to drop the fraud of all the crimes being alleged, people saying in here and in the public, gee, we're going to get the president because he colluded with Russia. How terrible was that? Well, that's all been disproved and dropped. So now we were left with bribery and extortion, and now those had to be dropped because there were no crimes. And I appreciate the gentleman bringing up crimes, but those are not alleged here. And so let me just say, this is a day that will live in infamy for the Judiciary Committee. The days of exemplary chairs like Daniel Webster when he stood for principle, those are going to be gone because this became a tool of the majority to try to use taxpayer funds to defeat a president. And by the way, the Ken Starr report, 36 boxes, he came in and testified. We were kept out of hearing the witnesses. There were, in the Watergate, these witnesses testified on television. It was public. It was not a star chamber like the Schiff chamber became. And I would like to yield back the remainder of my time to my friend, Mr. Jordan.
Well, I would just say, when did it happen? Everything Mr. Swalwell just said, if it all happened, why isn't it in the resolution? Democrats say there's some scheme to have an announcement made by President Zelensky to get a phone call with the president, to get a meeting with the president, and to get the aid released. When did the announcement happen? They got the call on July 25th. They got the meeting on September 25th. They got the money on September 11th. There was never an announcement from the Ukrainians to do an investigation. So you can keep saying all this stuff and all the points that this happened. Didn't happen, not the facts. Those are not the facts. And we know why the aid ultimately got released, because we learned that this guy, this new president, was actually the transformer, the real deal, was actually going to deal with the corruption issue in his country. That's what happened. You can make up all the things you want, but those are not the facts.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Jeffrey, for what purpose does Mr. Jeffrey seek recognition? Gentleman is recognized.
Let's actually go through the facts. We're here today because the president abused his power. We're here today because he solicited foreign interference in the 2020 election. He had welcomed foreign interference as it relates to Russia. He solicited foreign interference on the White House lawn with China, and he did it with Ukraine. He's a serial solicitor. Let's go through the facts. Congress allocated $391 million in military aid on a bipartisan basis to Ukraine, currently at war with Russian-backed separatists in the east. Ukraine's a friend, Russia's a foe. Ukraine's a democracy, Russia's a dictatorship. The United States is probably the only thing standing between Vladimir Putin and Ukraine being completely overrun as part of Putin's fantasy to reconstruct the Soviet Union, which would be adverse to the national security interests of the United States. And every single fact witnessed before this Congress said so. You can't even dispute that. So we allocated aid on a bipartisan basis. But then the aid was withheld. So the American people deserve to figure out why. In February, there was a letter sent by the Trump administration saying, okay, the aid is on the way. But it never arrived. In April, he had a phone call, the president, with Zelensky. The word corruption was not mentioned once. And then, in May, the Department of Defense wrote to this Congress and said, all necessary preconditions for the receipt of the aid have been met by the new Ukrainian government, including the implementation of anti-corruption protocols. We have that letter. It was sent to you and it was sent to us. Then in July, on the 18th, at an Office of Management and Budget meeting, the aid was officially frozen at the direction of the president. Twice during the summer, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican majority leader, publicly stated he called the Trump administration, what happened to the aid? Mitch McConnell couldn't get a good answer because there was no good answer. Then on July 25th, there's another call between President Trump and President Zelensky. The word corruption is not mentioned once. But here's what was said. Zelensky talks about defense. And the immediate response is, do us a favor, though. And President Trump says, I need you to look into some things, not related to procurement of defense arms, but related to a wild conspiracy theory connected to the 2016 campaign, and also says, I want you to look into Joe Biden. And then what's interesting, since you think it was such a perfect call, he mentions Rudolph Giuliani. I'm looking at the transcript right now. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Why on an official call would the president mention Rudolph Giuliani? He's not an ambassador. He's not the Secretary of State. He's not a member of the diplomatic corps. He's President Trump's political enforcer. And then what happens? You said you want to talk about the facts. In August, Giuliani travels to Madrid and meets with the Ukrainian government as a follow-up to Trump saying to Ukraine, go meet with Giuliani. And then a statement is drafted about this phony investigation and sent to the Ukrainians. But what happens? In August, the whistleblower complaint is filed. Then on September 9th, the whistleblower complaint is made public to Congress. 2 days later, on September 11th, all of a sudden, the aid is released. Why was the aid released? Because the president was caught red-handed, trying to pressure a foreign government to target an American citizen. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Gates seek recognition?
Strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
There were 5 meetings that we have detailed that show why the aid was released. There was a belief on the administration previously that Ukraine was one of the most corrupt countries in the world, that they had not engaged in sufficient reforms. And after a number of events with the vice president, with a bipartisan Senate delegation, there was a resolution of that aid. But this debate just lacks a certain sincerity. I heard earlier my friend from California, Mr. Swalwell, say, list out all these crimes. And so if I'm watching at home, I'm thinking, well, where are they in the impeachment? That is just a Democrat drive-by, to go and list crimes that you don't allege and that you don't have evidence for. If there is ever a microcosm of how to consume this day and the importance of it with the American people, it's that they're naming crimes in debate that they don't even have in their impeachment resolution because they can't prove them, because there are no underlying facts. And then I hear my friend from New York, Mr. Jeffries, bring up Russia. Russia, the residue of impeachment theories passed and failed. How are we even here debating about military aid, javelins, that President Trump delivered, that President Obama withheld? I hear them, crying these alligator tears, clutching their pearls over this notion that, Trump didn't give this aid, we got to go impeach him for it. Where was all this concern about how to make the Ukraine great again when Obama was president? You want to know our substantive defense? It's 4 things. They've never changed. I think Mr. Jordan dreams of them in his sleep. Both President Trump and President Zelensky said there was no pressure. We saw the call transcript, and there's no conditionality. There was never awareness on the part of the Ukraine that there was a delay in aid, and the Ukraine got the aid without opening the investigation that seems to be so troubling to Democrats. Everything you're going to hear them say today can be pretty much categorized into 3 areas. First, it's either stuff people presumed and had no direct evidence of, kind of their water cooler theory of the case. Second, it's hearsay. Somebody told somebody else that created some concern about the president's conduct. Or it is reflective of a sincere policy disagreement about how to make the Ukraine great again. I mean, I heard all these folks come by that are part of the diplomatic corps, and they sure seem to believe that we ought to do everything for the Ukraine, but if the president disagrees with that, it is not impeachable conduct. Essentially, they're alleging a shakedown. But I think most Americans know that you cannot have a shakedown if the person allegedly being shook down doesn't even know about the shakedown. You have President Zelensky himself saying, I felt no pressure. And then, talk about bad timing. We got this Time article that comes out on the 10th of December, just a few days ago, because their theory of the case is, well, even if Zelensky didn't know there was pressure, there's this other guy, Yermak, and Yermak knew from Gordon Sondland that there was pressure, but the same day that they introduced their articles of impeachment, Yermak gives this interview with Time magazine, and he says, and I quote, "Gordon and I were never alone together. We bumped into each other in the hallway next to the escalator as I was walking out. And I remember everything. It's fine with my memory. We talked about how well the meeting went. That is all we talked about." So here they are, with no crime, with no victim, with no witnesses, with no knowledge of any shakedown, and yet they proceed. To accept the Democrats' theory of the case, you got to believe that the Ukrainians are lying to us. You got to believe when they say there's no conditionality, no pressure, nothing wrong, that they're so weak and they're so dependent on the United States that we can't believe a word they say. Well, again, where were you during the Obama administration when this weak ally didn't get javelins that were then withheld? I support the Jordan Amendment because this Article 1, this abuse of power that they allege in the impeachment theory, is a total joke. They have to say abuse of power because they don't have evidence for obstruction. They have to say abuse of power because they have no evidence for bribery or treason. They have to say abuse of power because all those specific crimes that the gentleman from California named cannot be supported by the evidence. This is sort of the Rorschach inkblot test theory of impeachment, so that the country can stare at the inkblot and everybody can see what I guess they want to see. This notion of abuse of power is the lowest of low-energy impeachment theories. Heck, I don't know any political party that doesn't think when the other side's in the White House that they abuse power, they do too much. I got a lot of constituents that think Barack Obama abused his power, but you know what? We didn't do this to the country. We didn't put him through this nonsense and this impeachment. You all set the standard. We didn't set it. You said this would have to be bipartisan, compelling, and overwhelming. It ain't that, and this looks pretty bad. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose is Ms. Jayapal seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just in response...
Strike the last word?
Yes, move to strike the last word. Thank you.
Gentlelady is recognized.
In response to my colleague from Florida, you cannot argue things both ways. You cannot say that the president was so concerned about Ukraine that he released aid, which is true. He released aid in 2017. He released aid in 2018. And then suddenly he became concerned in 2019, right after Vice President Biden announced that he was going to run. So if your argument is that he was so concerned about Ukraine that he released aid in 2017 and 2018, then why in 2019, after the Department of Defense cleared Ukraine on charges of corruption, why then did he decide he was so concerned about corruption that he was not going to release aid?
Because
that makes, I'm sorry, I'm not yielding. I am not yielding. I am not yielding.
They got a new president, that's why.
Gentlelady has the time. The committee will be in order and people will not interrupt.
They got a new president who was...
not proper here.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentlelady
Chairman.
will continue.
They got a new president who was known to be an anti-corruption fighter. So that argument has no weight whatsoever. Now, if you want to argue that the president was so concerned about corruption at that particular moment, you have to look at the whole record of U.S. policy and our agreement that the Department of Defense would look under certain conditions before they release military aid to determine whether or not a country had satisfied those requirements around corruption, and the Department of Defense released that report. Nowhere between the time that Donald Trump withheld aid and the time that he released that aid was there an additional assessment required or done. In fact, the Department of Defense decided they didn't need to do another assessment because they had already done the assessment. So at the end of the day, I have only two questions for my colleagues on the other side. And these are the two questions. Forget about President Trump. Forget about President Trump. Will any one of my colleagues on the other side say that it is an abuse of power to condition aid on official acts? Well, forget about President Trump.
We do it.
Forget about President Trump. Is any one of my colleagues willing to say that it is ever okay for a president of the United States of America to invite foreign interference in our elections? Not a single one of you has said that so far.
I'll say.
I yield to my colleague from Texas.
Will the gentlelady yield so we can answer the question?
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I'll be glad to answer
You want to answer the question?
Paul.
She asked
I want to break this down.
The gentlelady has the time, and the
And
members,
she asked us a question.
the members here know perfectly well it is out of order to interrupt members who have the time. The gentlelady
Unless they
yielded-
ask you a
the
question.
gentlelady has yielded to whom?
She asked us a question.
Gentlelady yielded to whom? Ms. Escobar now has the time yielded by
Thank you,
Ms.
Chairman.
Jayapal.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Representative Jayapal. I want to break this down in simple terms for the American public because our Republican colleagues are working overtime to try to convince us that we didn't see what we saw with our own eyes and we didn't hear what we heard with our own ears. Let's bring it down to an example that was used during the hearing. If a governor, if a community suffers a natural disaster and the governor of the state has aid that will help that community, but calls the mayor of your community and says, I want you to do me a favor though, and conditions with giving the aid to the community on the police chief smearing his political opponent, has there been a crime? The answer is yes. And that governor would go to jail. If that governor later releases the aid after he got caught, it doesn't matter. He still committed the crime. Furthermore, if that governor says during the investigation, I'm going to defy the subpoenas, we're going to fight the subpoenas, guess what would happen to that governor? He's committed a crime. He would go to jail. If the governor then tried to cover up his wrongdoing, cover it up so that his people, his constituents, couldn't see his wrongdoing, what would happen to that governor? Did he commit a crime? Yes, he would go to jail. So as wildly as they're trying to convince you that there was no wrongdoing, I want the American public to understand what is going on here. It's clear as day. We've seen it with our own eyes. We've heard it with our own ears. Facts matter. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Escobar, and I would just again close with this single question. Is it ever okay for a president to condition official action on personal gain? I yield back.
Mr. Chairman. Unanimous, Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Unanimous consent request. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to introduce into the record.
I cannot hear you, sir.
Sorry?
I can't hear you.
I'd like to ask unanimous consent to introduce into the record the transcript of the call where the president says, I would like you to do us a favor.
Without objection, the transcript will be introduced. The call record will be introduced. For what purpose does Mr. Buck seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to address Mr. Swalwell's, thank you for coming back, Mr. Swalwell's comments that there are definitely crimes in this situation. First of all, I believe Mr. Swalwell, during the Mueller investigation, went on national TV and said something to the effect of an indictment is coming. He knew it. An indictment is coming. So I know Mr. Swalwell knows crimes. He was a prosecutor. And he also knows the obligation that a prosecutor has not to bring a crime, not to bring a charge unless there's a reasonable probability of conviction. I would direct Mr. Swalwell to the elements of bribery. Whoever, being a public official, corruptly demands or seeks personally anything of value in return for being influenced in the performance of an official act. The Department of Justice's Criminal Division Public Integrity Section opined in September that something as nebulous as an investigation is not of sufficient concrete value to constitute something of value under this statute. They also, the other element that is at question here, and one of the reasons I think that we need more than 1 week as the committee of jurisdiction to look into this matter is because if there are crimes, we should be bringing experts, we should be bringing in testimony, and if there is a crime, I think it is far more fair to charge pass articles of impeachment on a president where the president can defend against specific elements as opposed to something as vague as abuse of power. Mr. Swalwell, the official act that you talk about under the McConnell, Supreme Court's McConnell decision, that decision says, setting up a meeting, talking to another official, or organizing an event without more does not fit the definition of official act. There are two elements missing in your analysis, but that doesn't surprise me because there were no elements that were that the special counsel found in this situation. I think that it is unfortunate when the gentleman from Rhode Island talks about the president sending Mr. Giuliani to the Ukraine to smear Vice President Biden. Let's talk about what Vice President Biden did. His son sat on a board and made an outrageous amount of money for someone that had no background in energy, no background in the Ukraine, while his father was the vice president. If that is not a fair topic for discussion in the world of politics, I don't know what is. Smearing is trying to conjure up false information or making a vague argument based on false information. This isn't smearing. This is seeking the truth about corruption. Not a single member on the other side of the aisle has been willing to condemn the conduct of the former vice president. How frustrating it must be to be President Trump and have your son spend over $1 million on attorney's fees when the special counsel is investigating something that never happened. There was no collusion. There was no conspiracy between Russia and the Trump campaign. But there is clear evidence of wrongdoing between Hunter Biden, the former Vice President Joe Biden.
Would the gentleman yield?
No, I will not. And the Ukraine and the corporation Burisma. So the idea that there is a smear going on, let's look at the facts. And I will yield to my friend from Arizona, Mr. Biggs.
Thank you very much. Let's talk about what was going on. In 2017, 2018, aid was given. In 2019, there was a pause put on it. You have a new administration in the Ukraine, and the benchmarks, the anti-corruption benchmarks, were done under the previous administration, Poroshenko. That was testified to in this committee. But what we know is several of the previous corrupt administrators and cabinet-level officials, including some oligarchs, had close relationships to Zelensky. There was a concern whether Mr. Zelensky was the real deal. The aid was prospective, and the pause was unknown. U.S. officials continued to meet with Ukrainian officials, and they determined that Zelensky was the real deal, and so they made every effort to convince President Trump that that was the case. Once 2 new anti-corruption measures were released within 2 days, so was the funding. That's what changed. Yield back.
Mr. Chairman, unanimous consent request
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Just in response to Mr. Buck, a unanimous consent request for a Vox November 15, 2019 article, all of Robert Mueller's indictments, including the 34 people and 3 companies that he indicted in his lengthy investigation.
That objection.
I object. I want to see it.
The gentleman reserves an objection. He wants to see it. That's fair. For what purpose does Mr. Reschenthaler seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
That objection. I
yield to my good friend and colleague from Florida.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I just got to come back to this interview with Yermak because it was like the tree that fell in the forest that nobody heard that completely demolished the entire Democrat case. They have no evidence that the Ukrainians ever knew that this aid was withheld. So they're literally trying to prosecute an impeachment against the president for a shakedown when the alleged people being shook down, 1, said they felt no pressure, and 2, did not even know it was happening. And so then time and again, you heard them in in debate, in press conferences, in the whole circus show that's going on here say, well, we've got this testimony from Gordon Sondland. We all remember Gordon. Gordon Sondland wandering his way to an escalator with this guy who speaks English as a second language, and Gordon says, well, maybe I said something to him about this. Well, I mean, that was the whole deal for them. And then, I mean, you talk about embarrassing. The same day that they introduced their articles of impeachment that we knew they were going to introduce one way or another the moment they took the majority, it comes out that Yermak denies the whole thing. So show me the Ukrainian that was pressured. Show me the Ukrainian that knew that any of this was tied to any conditionality. There's no conditionality in the call, and so it's quite easy to answer Ms. Jayapal, the gentlelady from Washington's question. Very easy. In this case, there is no conditionality. You can't prove it. You have no evidence of it. And frankly, even the Ukrainians, even your purported victims, are coming out in the press and saying their theory of the case is wrong. Their fundamental premise has been rejected. I yield the gentleman from Ohio.
You got to yield back to.
I yield back to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Yes, I yield to my friend from Ohio.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Exactly. What changes? We got a brand new president who Zelensky ran on anti-corruption. Let's see if he's the real deal. And that's exactly what happened in the 55 days the aid was paused. We talked about 5 critical meetings that took place. 5 meetings. The last one I think is the most important because you had a Democrat senator and a Republican senator meet with President Zelensky in Kyiv. They knew the aid had been paused at that time. Ukrainians knew they'd learned a few days before that, and the issue never came up. But what did come up is both of these senators came back and said, this guy is the real deal, worth the risk, worth sending the hard-earned tax dollars of the American people to Ukraine. That is what happened, and the facts are very clear. You can make up all the stuff you want, but the facts are on the president's side. They've always been on the president's side. Democrats keep saying, to get the call, to get the meeting, to get the money, there had to be an announcement. It's December 12th. There is yet to be an announcement from Ukraine about any type of investigation into Burisma or the Bidens. Yet. Because it's not going to happen. Because it never needed to happen. That wasn't the point. But they got the call July 25th. They got the meeting September 25th. And they got the money September 11th. The other thing I want to point out. I don't know how many times I've heard this. The Democrats talk about this one sentence the president said in the now famous call transcript with President Zelensky. I would like you to do us a favor, though. The Democrats don't read the plain language. In fact, your star professor witness who was here last week, she talked about this being the royal we. She read the sentence the way you guys always try to portray the sentence. She said it was, I would like you to do me a favor, though. That's not what it says. It says, I would like you to do us a favor, though, because, and guess what the next 2 words are? Guess what the next 2 words are? Because our country, not because I. President doesn't say, I would like you to do me a favor, though, because I've been through a lot. He doesn't say that. It's very clear. I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot. And that is the understatement of the year. Heck yeah, our country's been through a lot. This is the day after Bob Mueller sat in front of this committee and we learned that there was nothing there. But 2 years he put our country through all kinds of turmoil because of you guys. That's what the president's pointing out, because in the end of this paragraph, he references Bob Mueller. That's what he's talking about. Heck yeah, our country had been through a lot, and the president was pretty ticked about it. He wanted to find out what was going on. That's very legitimate. That is working on behalf of the American people. But again, as I said last night, you guys don't respect the 63 million people who voted for this guy. That's why the Speaker of the House called the president an imposter. That's what's wrong. I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Johnson seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
With that, the gentleman is recognized.
I just want to slow this down and be very methodical about it, because most of us here are attorneys, and in this case, we're supposed to also be finders of fact. And we're supposed to carefully and objectively analyze the claims against the record. So let's do that. There are two articles to this impeachment resolution, of course, abuse of power and obstruction of justice. On the first, Democrats know there is zero direct evidence in the record of these proceedings to show that President Trump engaged in any scheme of any kind, as is alleged in the resolution, or that he intended in his dealings with Ukraine to influence the 2020 election. No impeachment should ever proceed on the basis of hearsay and conjecture and speculation that wouldn't even be admissible in a local traffic court, and we say that over and over. To my friend, Ms. Jayapal, there is simply no evidence of any condition, and I guess I need to repeat the four indisputable facts again that are in this record, because repetition apparently is really necessary here. First, both President Trump and Zelensky say there was no pressure exerted. Number two, the July 25th call transcript shows no conditionality between aid funding and an investigation. Number three, Ukraine was not aware of the aid, as has been said over and over here, that it was being delayed. And number four, they never opened an investigation. They still received the aid and they got the meeting. Our colleagues keep misrepresenting the facts. Not only do they misrepresent the do me a favor versus do us a favor, but only 3 of the 17 witnesses called by Chairman Schiff listened in on a call, okay? Only 3 of them. And contrary to the assertions that we've heard this morning, they didn't provide key, uncontrovertible, firsthand testimony of what happened on the call. All 3 of the testimonies contradicted each other. So the 3 people that listened in directly didn't even know. The evidence shows that President Trump holds a deep-seated, genuine, and reasonable skepticism of Ukraine due to its history of pervasive corruption, and his administration sought proof that the newly elected president was a true reformer. Of course, as has been pointed out, the president soon found out that he is a swamp drainer, and that's why the funds were released. President Trump wanted to ensure that the American taxpayer-funded security assistance would not be squandered by what has been reported as the 3rd most corrupt nation in the world before Zelensky. And the discussions they had were never about what will happen in 2020, but rather about what happened in 2016. So the second claim of this resolution is that the president obstructed Congress, but he simply did what virtually every other president in the modern era has also done. What's his big infraction here? He asserted a legitimate executive privilege and legal immunity to question subpoenas issued by various White House officials. There's no evidence of any impeachable conduct with that. It's very commonplace. On every previous occasion of this assertion in the past, the natural impasse that exists between the executive and legislative branches in our constitutional system has been easily and calmly resolved either by a good faith negotiation or a simple filing with the 3rd branch of our government, the judicial branch. We let the courts decide it. In spite of their allegations here, Democrats know President Trump has lawful cause to challenge those subpoenas in this matter. In this case, House Democrats are trying to impeach President Trump simply for seeking judicial review over whether the direct communications between high-ranking advisors and a president under these circumstances are privileged or should be disclosed. That case would be expedited in the courts. It wouldn't take that long. But Democrats said they don't have time for that. Why? Because they promised their base an impeachment by Christmas. This whole thing is so absurd. It should be noted, by the way, that President Trump has consistently cooperated with Congress in fulfilling its oversight and investigation responsibilities here. Over 25 administration officials have testified before Oversight Committee this year, 20 before this committee. At the start of the impeachment inquiry, the White House produced more than 100,000 pages of documents to the Oversight Committee. And of course, he also quickly declassified and produced to everyone the call transcript. Democrats know this is an absurd charge about obstruction, and the truth is, in the history of the Republic, there's never been a single-party fraudulent impeachment process deployed against a president like the one that is being used against Donald Trump. They're the ones seeking to nullify our vital constitutional safeguards with this sham. Their ultimate objective is to nullify the votes of the 63 million Americans who voted to elect Donald Trump to president. They violated due process and all the rest. My colleague, Sheila Jackson-Lee, a little while ago, evoked and quoted Barbara Jordan, but she's the one that said during the Watergate inquiry, impeachment not only mandates due process, but due process quadrupled. They have violated that here. They have violated the rules, and everybody in the country can see it. This impeachment's going to fail. The Democrats will pay a heavy political price for it, but the Pandora's box they've opened today will do irreparable injury to our country in the years ahead. That's why we're concerned. That's why the facts matter. And that's why we need to move on. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes?
Chairman.
Ms. Garcia, seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm opposed to this amendment. It is incredible to me that the other side of the aisle has not seen the facts and has not apparently read some of the evidence before us. It is obvious to me that this president has put his personal interests above this country. And with that, I'll yield back to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cicilline.
Rhode Island.
Sorry? Rhode Island. Oh, Rhode Island.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. We've just heard our Republican colleagues claim that there was no demand, no conditionality for the release of this aid. And in fact, it was motivated by the president's deep desire to ferret out corruption. That is laughable. The president of the United States had 2 phone calls with President Zelensky. He never once even uttered the word corruption, because it wasn't about corruption. And the reason we know that is the Department of Defense had already certified that steps had been taken to combat corruption back on May 23rd. And despite that certification, that hold remained in place. In fact, the professionals testified about them trying to figure out, how is it possible it's legal to hold this aid? Because the certification is happening, there's no basis to hold it other than the president ordered it. So it's not about corruption. It was about extracting a commitment to announce publicly that they were launching an investigation of President Trump's chief political rival, a smear against Vice President Biden. So this notion that really what happened is the president just satisfied himself that Mr. Zelensky was for real is nonsense and betrayed by all of the evidence collected. Let me give you some of it or remind you of it because you apparently don't remember it. Ambassador Sondland testified under oath. Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine, Mr. Giuliani, by the way, the president's counsel, Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing the investigation of the 2016 election, the DNC server, and Burisma. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew these investigations were important to the President. On a July 25th call, President Zelensky himself recognized the connection between the meeting and the investigations. And he said, I also want to thank you for your invitation to visit the United States, specifically Washington, D.C. On the other hand, I also want to assure you that we'll try to be very serious about the case and we'll work on the investigation. And the President spoke in that call about the Bidens and Burisma. And the OMB that ultimately announces that the aid was withheld gives no explanation. And everyone in the intelligence community, all the national security team, all recommended the release of the aid. This was an important ally of the United States facing an active war with the Russians that took part of their country and was continuing to kill people in eastern Ukraine. American military aid was a lifeline for this emerging democracy. You know the only people who benefited from this scheme? President Trump, because he thought he was going to get an announcement to smear his political opponent, and Vladimir Putin, Russia, that were trying to weaken the Ukrainians. And there was a recent article Congresswoman Bass held up that captured this, where it said, President Zelensky facing President Putin all alone. So this benefited Russia, weakening Ukraine. But this notion that the reason that the aid was released because the president was satisfied is defied by all of the evidence collected in a 300-page report by the Intelligence Committee. It was released because the president got caught. The whistleblower filed a report, a complaint, alleging an elaborate scheme by the president that betrayed the national interests of our country, that undermined our national security, that advanced the personal political interests of the president, not the national interests of our country, that attempted to corrupt our elections by dragging in foreign interference. It's the highest of high crimes and misdemeanors. Our framers spoke about this abuse of power, of using the office of the presidency to advance your own personal interests and to undermine the public interest. And I'll yield to Mr. Raskin my remaining 30 minutes.
Thank you very much. You know,
Ms. Garcia's time to yield. Does she wish to yield to Mr. Raskin?
I yield to Mr. Raskin.
Ms. Garcia, thank you very much. Just to flesh out the detail of what the gentleman from Rhode Island was saying, one of the depositions was from David Holman, who was a State Department official at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, who was with Gordon Sondland, who testified that there was a quid pro quo, but he saw him on the phone with President Trump, and he reported right at that time to him, he said, the president doesn't give a blank about Ukraine. He's interested in the big stuff. And what's the big stuff? Whatever can benefit him.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Biggs seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last night and today we've heard many times my colleagues on the other side saying the facts of this are not contested, but they are. They really are. An example is one just pointed out, highlighted by my colleague from Louisiana just a moment ago. On the telephone call, listening, of the 17 witnesses that came in, only 3 actually listened in on the phone call. But each one of them have contradictory testimony. And so even the 3 witnesses that heard the call conflicted. And why is that important? Why did I bring that up?
Yeah.
I bring it up because of this. Many of my colleagues, in fact, most of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, take every inference in the light most negative to the President of the United States. That's because there's an animus there that has been manifest since November 9th, 2016, the day after he was elected. And so, having watched this procedure closely on the heels of the other procedures and the attempts to impeach this president and investigate, I am left wondering, you want every inference to go against the president? Why should the American public give you any inference of credibility? The reality is, when my colleague from California was talking about the Russian issue, not a single American was indicted for conspiring with Russia to influence the elections. Not one. He still believes that there was some kind of collusion with the Trump campaign. Well, what do the facts actually get to? So when my colleague just talked about the money was released, the aid was released, again, he takes this inference based on a timeline, and he's citing rank hearsay. A guy comes in and says, hey, you know what? I overheard this conversation. I'm in a restaurant. Actually, we're sitting on a patio at a restaurant, lots of people around. But boy, I could hear everything. I knew who it was. I knew what was said. And so I was so concerned about it, I didn't tell anybody. I came in once this really got going and revved up. You want to take every inference against the president. Why should we give you any inference of credibility? The only direct evidence in this case remains the same after all this time. No pressure. No pressure in the phone call. Mr. Zelensky has said that repeatedly. He has said that. He spent 8 hours in one press conference all day long talking about no pressure. There's no pressure. Yermak said there was no pressure. Are they lying? No, but we know the whistleblower was lying. We know that Mr. Schiff was lying. Mr. Schiff came out the day before and said 8 times the president put direct pressure on the Ukrainians. Oops, the transcript's released. Not true. That would be the facts being contested, absolutely. We know that there was no conditionality. Everybody said there's no conditionality. Everybody that participated, everybody listened. Ukraine was unaware of the hold, so how can you leverage them? They were unaware of the hold. And there was never any investigation. But what happened? What triggered it? You have high-ranking U.S. officials going to the Ukraine, meeting with them, convinced the president. You have the president of Ukraine signing 2 pieces of legislation reinstituting the anti-corruption tribunal and also removing immunity from prosecution of the legislative branch in the Ukraine. Significant anti-corruption measures, worthy of convincing this president that, yes, they're worth a chance. And so with that, you have nothing. Your credibility is in tatters, quite frankly. With that, I yield to my friend from Colorado.
I thank my friend for yielding, and I just want to ask my friends on the other side, Mr. Sondland, Ambassador Sondland is your star witness? Really? You're basing an impeachment on Ambassador Sondland's testimony? His first statement, his first deposition, he said 325 times, I don't remember, I don't know, I'm not sure. 325 times. You don't think when this gets over to the Senate that he's going to be impeached on all the things he didn't remember, then his testimony impeached, not his office. I see the smirk. Then, what does he do? He reads and he listens to what Ambassador Taylor says that he knows, and what Ambassador Yovanovitch says that he knows, and what all these people say that he knows, and then his memory is refreshed. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes Mr. Ratcliffe seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank the chairman. I want to respond to my good friend, Congressman Ciciline's comments when he said that President Trump's demand can't be explained by corruption because the word corruption is never uttered anywhere in the transcript. The problem with that is that the Democrats have built this entire fake impeachment scheme around an alleged demand. Guess what word is not anywhere in the transcript? Demand. Nowhere in that transcript does the president make a demand. Do you know where the word demand came from? It came from the whistleblower. That's the first time we heard the word demand. When he notified the Inspector General for the intelligence community, he said President Trump made a demand. He thought he could do that because he thought no one would ever be able to prove, because what president would take the unprecedented step of releasing a transcript with a foreign leader? This president did, something that the whistleblower never expected. President Trump, we keep hearing, got caught. President Trump, we keep hearing, is obstructing justice. The president that took the unprecedented step of releasing a transcript so that everyone could see the truth is not obstructing Congress. The president didn't get caught. The whistleblower got caught. The whistleblower made false statements. The whistleblower got caught with Chairman Schiff. Remember Chairman Schiff, the person that the Democrats, instead of the House Judiciary Committee, which has spent a full week on this, that's not who's been in charge. The person they put in charge was the person that got caught with the whistleblower. Have you spoken directly with the whistleblower? No, we have not. We'd like to. That wasn't true. The person that said he had evidence of the first fake impeachment scam, collusion with Russia, had evidence of that collusion and didn't have it. The person who, in the course of that, read into the record the Steele dossier because the people needed to know the truth about what happened. Well, we heard about the truth about the Steele dossier this week when the Inspector General told us it was all garbage, rubbish, all made up. Yeah, that Chairman Schiff. And now he got caught not being truthful about a whistleblower who, as I told you the other day, didn't tell the truth verbally and in writing, and that's in a transcript. You know what we didn't get in this 1 week impeachment summary in the House Judiciary Committee? We didn't get that transcript. Chairman Schiff didn't send that one over. Only if you were on the Intelligence Committee have you seen that transcript. I've seen it. I'd like everyone to see it. With that, I yield to my good friend, Congressman Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I want to go back to where Mr. Buck was referencing the gentleman from Rhode Island when he mentioned Mr. Sondland as, again, the guy they mentioned 611 times in their report. Mr. Sondland, the guy who presumed there was a quid pro quo, the guy who had to file an addendum to his deposition testimony. And in that addendum, again, he has this great sentence where he says, Ambassador Taylor recalls that Mr. Morrison told Ambassador Taylor that I told Mr. Morrison that I had conveyed this message to Mr. Yarmouk on September 1st, 2019, in connection with Vice President Pence's visit to Warsaw and a meeting with President Zelensky. 6 people, again, having 4 conversations in 1 sentence. Here's the interesting thing. Yarmouk talks with Sondland. Sondland talks with Morrison. Morrison talks with Taylor. And somehow through all that, we get the Democrats believing that there was this quid pro quo and that they need to impeach the president. But what they forget is what Mr. Gates brought up just a few minutes ago. Yarmouk talks with Sondland. Sondland talks with Morrison. Morrison talks with Taylor. And this is part of their scheme. Guess what? 2 days ago, the guy who started it, Yarmouk, said it didn't happen. But that's their guy, Mr. Sondland. Had to file the addendum to his testimony. Had to write this sentence to clarify. I think this is amazing. This is the clarification. Ambassador Taylor recalls that Mr. Morrison told Ambassador Taylor that I told Mr. Morrison that I conveyed this message to Mr. Yarmouk on September 1st, 2019, in connection with Vice President Pence's visit to Warsaw and a meeting with President Zelensky. Yarmouk's the key here, and it didn't happen. He just told us that. Time magazine just reported it the very same day as Mr. Gates pointed out that you all filed your articles of impeachment. Holy cow, this is what it comes down to. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does...
Mr. Chairman, I have unanimous consent. Move to strike the last word.
For what purpose does Ms. Deming seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
You know, let me just say, I've been pretty shocked and disappointed with my colleagues on the other side. There have been so many things that have been said, like the president never used the word demand. Well, I can tell you this, when a robber points a gun at you to take your money, they usually don't walk up and say, I'm robbing you right now. The other argument that we've heard this morning is that, well, the aid was released. It was eventually released. There was no investigation. There was no announcement of an investigation. But you know, the aid was released because the president got caught. It was released after the whistleblower's complaint. It was released after public reports that the aid was being held because Ukraine was being coerced into doing an investigation. And Congress had initiated congressional investigations into why the aid was being released. We can talk about alternative facts all day long, but the facts are really pretty clear. That the president abused his power, the precious power of his office, to coerce a country that was dependent on us. A country who's fighting Russian aggression, because when Ukraine fights Russian aggression, they're helping us fight Russian aggression. And he did it for personal gain, and he should be held accountable. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
Mr. Chairman, I have unanimous consent request.
Who seeks recognition for unanimous consent?
Biggs from Arizona.
The gentleman is recognized for unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first unanimous consent request is the record of the correspondence and subpoenas served on executive branch officials by Chairman Schiff. And we have concerns because 3 of those were served prior to the passage of H.R.S. 660.
We'll reserve the right to object. We'll take a look at that.
Thank you, and I have another one, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman will state it.
Thank you. It is 2 letters sent by the Office of the Vice President dated October 15 and December 11. The first explains the overbroad scope of the document request from Chairman Schiff, but offers to work with Congress to advance legitimate oversight authorities. The second letter points out an inaccuracy in Chairman Schiff's report. Contrary to an assertion contained in Chairman Schiff's report at the time of the release of this
Are these
report.
public correspondence?
They are correspondence between the Vice President and
without
Schiff.
objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does Ms. Roby seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I yield to my friend, Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you. I think that we got to remember that the abuse of power is coming from the quid pro quo charge, which then morphed into bribery. The problem is that my colleagues across the aisle can't make out what, again, we call a prima facie case, meaning the elements are not supported by the facts. So let's just go back and look at the federal statute for bribery. The elements are as follows. Whoever, being a public official, corruptly demands or seeks personally anything of value in return for being influenced in the performance of an official act. Now, we could tear apart each one of these elements, but let me just focus on corruptly. The president didn't have corrupt intent, and that's why the Democrats cannot make out a prima facie case. Contrary to Schiff's parody version of the July 25th call, the president wasn't asking Ukraine to, quote unquote, make up dirt about my opponent. That quote came from a parody from Chairman Schiff. The president didn't say it in the phone call. For whatever reason, that is being missed. There was also significant reason to believe that the Bidens were involved in corruption, and there's also evidence Ukrainian officials colluded with Democrats in the 26th campaign. Now, there's been a lot of talk about this being a conspiracy theory. That's not a conspiracy theory. The Hill, Politico, Financial Times all reported on this, and for whatever reason now, it's being labeled a conspiracy theory. Also, the president was not seeking to help with his 2020 campaign. Rather, he was seeking accountability regarding Ukraine Democrat collusion in 2016 and also potential corruption in the Obama administration's dealing with Ukraine as well. And we have to remember, too, what Professor Turley said. And remember, Professor Turley voted for Hillary Clinton. He is not a Trump supporter. He was very impartial. And he said, and I quote the professor, "Trump does not state a quid pro quo in the call. He's using his influence to prompt the Ukrainians to investigate and to cooperate with the Justice Department. If President Trump honestly believed there was a corrupt agreement with Hunter Biden that was not fully investigated by the Obama administration, the request for an investigation is not corrupt." And again, I was quoting Professor Turley. I'd also like to quote the Mueller report. And just an aside, we have to remember, months ago, Robert Mueller came in here and he said there was no evidence of collusion, no evidence of obstruction. But again, we're back here. Okay, let me just go back to the Mueller report. There was discussion of corruptly in that report. As it pertains to obstruction of justice, it was stated, quote, "corruptly means acting with an improper motive or with intent to obtain an improper advantage for himself or someone else, inconsistent with the official duty and the rights of others." By that standard, by Mueller's own standard, the president's behavior is entirely inconsistent with the definition of the underlying statute. With that, I yield back to my friend and colleague from Alabama.
I yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomer.
I thank my friend, Ms. Roby, so much. First of all, I was astounded, having been a prosecutor. I've defended some cases. I've been a judge. I've sent a lot of people to prison, but I've never sent someone to prison where the victim didn't know or figure out that they were a victim. That's extraordinary to hear, that you can commit a crime like bribery or theft or robbery, and the victim never knows, never figures out there's a victim. That I've never sent anybody to prison when the victim didn't know they were a victim. And,
Ms. Gomer,
yes.
I want to bring you, Ms. Roby.
Ms. Roby's time.
Let it go.
I yield to Mr. Collins.
Let it go. No, get back to Ms. Gomer.
All right. And also, there's probably nobody on this committee that has followed what has happened over time in Ukraine more than I have. And there's no question Putin wants the old Soviet empire back. And what happened when President Bush was in office, Putin had Russia invade Georgia. And President Bush reacted strongly, and he put sanctions in place. And so what happened when President Obama took office and Secretary Clinton was in office, they went over there with a red plastic reset button, and the message was clear to Putin. Look, Bush overreacted when you invaded Georgia, so you can invade Ukraine, and we're okay. That may not have been what they intended, but that's exactly what Putin heard, and that's why he invaded Ukraine, Crimea, and you're upset at Trump, for heaven's sake.
The gentlelady's time is expired. For what purpose does Mr. Raskin seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much. Our colleagues reprove Mr. Cicilline for raising Ambassador David Sondland, who is President Trump's ambassador to the EU, which is fascinating to me, of course, because that's President Trump's pick. He contributed $1 million to the Trump campaign. He became the ambassador to the EU. They don't like him now because he clarified his testimony to say, yes, there was definitely a quid pro quo at the heart of this whole thing. So now, of course, they turn on the president's own ambassador, but we don't have to rely on his word. I started to mention this before because he had a lunch with David Holmes, who was a senior State Department official at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, and they went out to a restaurant, and Ambassador Sondland got President Trump on the phone. And afterward, Holmes could hear the conversation, and this is all uncontradicted by other witnesses who were there. And essentially, Ambassador Sondland said to him that, Zelensky loves your ass, and you're going to get exactly what you want from him. And afterwards, Holmes says, well, what is it we can get from him? Well, it's the big stuff. And Holmes says, the big stuff, well, you mean like the war, dealing with Russia and so on? No, the big stuff, what President Trump cares about. Okay, now I'm not quoting verbatim because I don't have it in front of me, but the substance of this is very clear. What does he care about? What can benefit him, like the Bidens? And it's very clear from multiple witnesses exactly what President Trump wanted to get from President Zelensky. He wanted a statement on television that Ukraine was investigating and was going to investigate Vice President Joe Biden. And he wanted a statement contradicting the 2016 understanding by our Intelligence Committee and by Special Counsel Mueller that there had been a sweeping and systematic campaign by Russia to interfere in our campaign, and saying it was Ukraine that interfered in our campaign. That's what he wanted. That was the big stuff. He didn't care about the Russian war on the people of Ukraine. He didn't care about corruption. They invite us to believe that Donald Trump is an anti-corruption crusader who was shaking down President Zelensky about corruption when he doesn't raise any corruption on that call except for what he believed was going on with the Bidens, except that he reduced anti-corruption funding for Ukraine, except he doesn't raise it anywhere else that we can find. And what do you know? You pick up the New York Times yesterday, President Trump had to pay $2 million to charities because he ripped off his own charity for millions of dollars. This is the anti-corruption crusader they want us to believe in. The guy who had to pay $25 million to students at the phony Trump University, which the Attorney General of New York called a classic bait-and-switch operation. This is the guy that they want us to believe was shaking down the president of Ukraine because he had some secret anti-corruption agenda that actually wasn't related to the Bidens, that wasn't related to rehabilitating the totally discredited Russian conspiracy theory that it was Ukraine and not Russia that interfered in our campaign in 2016. Come on, get real, be serious. We know exactly what happened here. 17 witnesses. It's uncontradicted. There's no rival story. No rival story at all. And our colleagues will not even tell us whether in theory they think it would be wrong for the President of the United States to shake down foreign governments to come and get involved in our presidential campaigns in order to harm the president's political opponents. They won't even tell us in principle whether they think that's wrong, because they think it's too dangerous at that point. We know that they don't accept the facts. We know they don't accept the evidence. They don't like the fact that the depositions took place in the basement. Where should they have been? On the first floor? The second floor? Would they accept the facts? If we found some other room, would that be all right? Because their people were there. I was in that room. There were Democrats, there were Republicans. The Democratic counsel got an hour. The Republican counsel got an hour. It was even on both sides. Enough of these phony process objections. Let's get back to the facts of what happened. The President of the United States shook down a foreign power to come and get involved in our election. That's wrong. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman, down here.
For what purpose does gentleman seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
No.
Their side.
The
Sorry?
gentleman, Mr. Armstrong is recognized. For what purpose does Mr. Armstrong seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I think it bears mentioning that there's a lot about David Holmes I would say, but what I would say first is that for a guy who heard part of one half of a 3-minute phone call, he had a 40-minute opening statement. And Sondland testified that Biden was never linked in his mind until the transcript was released at the end of August. And the Democratic report does not the Republican report, the Democratic report does not establish any linkage between the announcement or understanding of investigations for his personal political benefit. The only testimony Democrats rely on to prove that allegation is Ambassador Sondland's testimony. However, they conveniently leave out the most crucial aspect of the ambassador's testimony, and that is, after being questioned, he only presumed the linkage. In fact, he admitted in his public testimony that no one in the world told him there was any linkage. But this is the basis for the Democratic Article 1. But I want to go to a little broader reason of why we should accept Mr. Jordan's amendment. A Democratic senator was quoted saying, "Never, in my view, had America been led by such a dangerous head of state. He bemoaned that America was misled by a reckless and arrogant president." That was Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia describing George W. Bush. Ronald Reagan was accused of abuse of power for pushing a growth-based economic agenda, for committing troops to Lebanon, or for turning back the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Clinton, excluding the impeachment, was accused of abusive accusations for an Asia fundraising scandal. 4 dozen donors were arrested. Aides getting sweetheart appointments, use of the FBI to dig up dirt on political employees, Waco, and a Swedish slush fund. George W. Bush was accused of abuse of power for domestic spying, an energy task force controversy, Presidential Records Act, steel tariffs, the Iraq War, and NSA overreach. Obama's IRS engaged in politically motivated targeting of charitable groups. Fast and Furious gun running scandal, collected telephone records on AP journalists without a warrant. The seizure of private property under the guise of environmental protection. The problem we're running into, which is going to last far longer than today and far longer than this Congress, is this will become the new normal. Every one of those things I mentioned had reports written about them. They probably had election consequences. There were hearings held. Do you know what they didn't have? A nebulous, ambiguous charge of abuse of power. If you cannot prove an underlying crime, you do not get to use all of the evidence you're presenting forward. This will continue. This will move forward. In the history of our country, the party who is not in the White House has accused the White House of abuse of power. It started 200 years ago. It will continue into the future, except now, congratulations. It will be impeachment every single time one party controls the House of Representatives and the other party is in the White House. And with that, I yield to my friend from Louisiana.
I thank my friend. I just want to point out we are talking about, and we have been for the last 2 hours, this amendment that Mr. Jordan brought. He wants to strike Article 1 of the resolution because the resolution isn't worth the paper it's written on. Why do we need to do that? Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution is what gives us the standard for impeaching a president. You got to have treason, you got to have bribery or a high crime and misdemeanor. You guys have defaulted to this amorphous abuse of power allegation. It's not a criminal act. It's not a crime. It's certainly not a high crime. There's one problem that everybody can, to summarize all this, if you're getting lost in the arguments at home, here's what it comes down to. In the 243-year history of this country, there's only 2 previous presidents that have been impeached by a vote of the House. It was, of course, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. In both of those, and in the lengthy Nixon impeachment investigation, evidence clearly established that specific criminal acts were committed. Evidence clearly established that specific criminal acts were committed. These guys don't have that here. They know it. You know it. It's not on paper in the resolution in Article 1 or Article 2. It's in nothing that's been said here in the last 2 hours. These facts don't change. This is a completely unprecedented, single-party impeachment charade, and everybody at home can see that clearly. These things don't change, and they won't. I yield back to my friend.
It's Mr. Armstrong's time.
Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong.
Yield to my friend from Florida.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. No evidence. Quote, when Time asked Yermak if he ever felt there was a connection between U.S. military aid and the request for investigations, Yermak was adamant. We never had that feeling. We did not have the feeling this aid was connected to any one specific issue. Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter this Time magazine article 12/10/2019 into the record.
Without objection, it'll be the article will be entered. For what purpose does Mr. Cohen seek recognition?
Right, the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, sir. I took theater and drama when I was in college, one course. And I was told the first thing you have to do is have the willing suspension of disbelief. The Republicans obviously took that course over and over and over again. And they don't, I mean, they're the Fifth Avenue crowd. They've talked about Sondland. That's the man the president appointed as his ambassador to the EU. That's the man he said was a great guy. That's the man who's still employed. And Sondland said they were all in the loop. Pompeo, Giuliani, Mulvaney, Bolton, they were all in the loop. And it was about the quid pro quo. It was about having an investigation announced on CNN, and then you'll get the military aid. And Sondland told in Warsaw, one of the aides to President Zelensky, you've got to announce the investigation. It was a strong arm. They did it. And where do we get these people in the loop to testify? They've been asked to testify. The president says no. He won't let them testify because he knows that if they tell the truth, it will hurt his case because they know that they held up the military aid. President Zelensky has no choice. He needs America to protect himself from the big bear, Russia. They say he hasn't said that he felt pressured. Well, A, he's an actor, and B, he's a politician. And he depends on us. He has no choice. And so he can't say that. But you knew it, and he told people, and he knew the aid was being withheld. They knew it on July the 25th. There were communications from the embassy that have been released that they knew the aid was being held up. They knew it was being held up. There was no reason for President Trump to tell Sondland, no quid pro quo, I don't want anything, except for saying, I want you to testify that I told you this, because he knew that the whistleblower had come out and blown their cover. And he knew that the jig was up. So he needed to find a way to say something that would be in the record, and Sondland remembered it. And Sondland, their best witness, they talk about the three professors, three of the most respected professors in America, all of who came in here and said this is the most impeachable president. These abuse of power is one of the most serious offenses you can imagine. It's the Constitution. It's the law of the land. And if you abuse your power, that's the most impeachable crime you could be charged with. And they forget their witness, Mr. Turley, said what the president did was wrong. He didn't come in and give a clean bill of health to the president. He said you need some more information. You need some more proof. But you can't get the proof because the president won't allow his men to testify. One of them's writing a book. One of them's still an interim job. The other one's running for senator. They can't do it. The proof is there. This is the most abusive act we can imagine, trying to influence our elections with foreign interference. That takes power away from the American people. And that would end our country as we know it, a democracy, a shining city on the hill, a beacon of hope to people around the world who followed our revolution by changing their governments to giving people the power and not kings. And this is a way to revert back to a king, a man who thinks he can do whatever he wants. If it's Article 2 says, I can do whatever I want, I'm president. That's not right. When he said, I need a favor, though, he was talking about getting dirt on the Bidens. He feared Joe Biden as his primary political rival. Michael Cohen told us the president doesn't come out and say exactly what he wants. He speaks in code. That's the president's code. Michael Cohen knows it, and Michael Cohen is in prison now. Individual 1 is not in prison because individual 1 could not be indicted because of the Justice Department's policies that say you can't indict a sitting president. But Michael Cohen, who is in prison because he facilitated the payments to Ms. Daniels and the payments to Ms. McDougal. You talk about abuse of power. Abuse of power is having a charitable foundation and taking advantage of the charities and using the money for your own purposes and having to pay a $2 million fine and not being allowed to be on a board ever again because you don't have the character to be over a charitable foundation. Abuse of power is ripping off people with Trump University and paying $25 million. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes, Mr. Klein seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to go into why I don't see any of the remarks from the gentleman from Tennessee in these articles of impeachment, but I do want to say I'm a little incredulous. As a prosecutor, I'm just so amazed at what the majority are calling facts. They keep talking about the facts and the evidence. Well, their evidence is in dispute because it's based on hearsay, opinion, and speculation. These are not facts. This is testimony about what somebody thought or what somebody concluded from acts taken by members of the administration. The charge is abuse of power, but what the majority is really upset about is the fact that the president and the administration is exercising its power under the Constitution. Its authorized powers, for example, the president's authority to set foreign policy and fire, for example, an ambassador is not a smear on an official. It's the use of Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. The president is authorized by statute to put a stop on the distribution of funds. The president is instructed in the NDAA to ask for and monitor investigations into corruption in the Ukraine. When you talk about direct testimony from individuals like Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Mr. Morrison, you have the fact that they were on the call, and the transcript speaks for itself, but you have opinions and conclusions after that. And when it comes to actual testimony that hasn't been heard, it just shows that the majority really doesn't have any interest in getting to the bottom of this question, because if they did care about actually finding out facts, they would be calling Mr. Yermak back into this committee. They would be delaying this process, because what we have read from this article in Time magazine is incredible and exculpatory and, quite frankly, a bombshell. When you have specific rejection of claims made by Ambassador Sondland that he was told the aid to Ukraine would not be released unless investigations were launched, why is he not in here? When asked if he thought there was a connection between the aid and the investigations, Yermak stated, "We never had that feeling." He added that we had a clear understanding that the aid had been frozen. We honestly said, okay, that's bad, what's going on here? We were told they would figure it out, and after a certain amount of time, the aid was unfrozen. We didn't have the feeling that this aid was connected to any one specific issue. If you ignored this evidence and you were in a court case, you would lose your law license for allowing a case to go forward without this exculpatory evidence being provided to the defense. It is just so ridiculous to me that we are not taking time to look further into this. And with that, I want to yield to Mr. Collins, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Klein. Well, I appreciate so much the gentleman from Tennessee. He just answered a ton of questions for me about his understanding of props and theatrics by his study of drama in his higher education, because now we understand a lot of things. But also we have another thing. Folks who study drama also understand you read the lines. They can read the transcript. Quit saying, I want you to do me a favor. It's not in the transcript. It must be hard to read. I guess me and us gets confused when you're trying to make up facts. That's what's happening here. But he also just proved my point why Mr. Jordan's article is actually, the amendment is actually good, because it's what I have said all along. The moment I saw that they decided to use abuse of power, what they did is they gave their whole conference carte blanche to make up anything they want and call it abuse of power, because they don't have anything else to give. They don't have actual crime that they can add up. If they did, was portrayed from the gentleman from Maryland and so many others, if you had the crime, if you had it, you would long to put it, you had to put it in the articles. You didn't do it. But then the last thing that is amazing to me, and the gentleman from Tennessee said it, he called Mr. Zelensky a politician and an actor in a derisive way, basically implying politicians lie. Well, we've seen that this morning, even in just what they're talking about, how they can't even read a transcript, and that he's an actor. It's amazing to me how we on this committee are degrading Mr. Zelensky in the eyes of his country and in the world because we can't make a case against this president. This is the tragedy of this impeachment right now, is they're trying to degenerate because they can't make the fact that he felt pressured. That is the critical element of their case. I yield back to Mr. Klein.
Unanimous consent request.
Who yields back? Who's seeking recognition?
Unanimous consent request.
Who is seeking recognition for unanimous consent request? The gentleman will say his unanimous consent.
I would like unanimous request to introduce the editorial from the USA Today that called for the impeachment of the president.
Without objection.
From the Los Angeles Times, from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and from the Boston Globe.
Without
I
objection.
object. I want to read it.
Objection is heard.
I'd love for him to read them.
Who else seeks
It
recognition?
proves that I can read. Transcripts undoubtedly are not be able to
Who
read.
seeks recognition? Does anyone else seek recognition on this amendment? For what purpose does Mr. Stubbe seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman is recognized.
The fact that members of this committee would insinuate that Ukrainians died at the hand of Russians because they didn't get aid is absolutely ridiculous. Having actually served in a combat theater and knowing what that is like, to blame that aid was delayed a few weeks would have saved lives is frankly insulting to me and to all that served. Now Democrats want you to believe that Ukrainians died and it's Trump's fault. Why don't we impeach him on that? Members on the other side of the aisle on this committee now are talking about bribery and laying out a case for bribery and laying out elements for bribery. Yet, if their case was so compelling and overwhelming and they had all the elements, then why isn't it in the articles of impeachment? It's not in either one. They didn't include it because there's no evidence for that charge. The aid was released before the deadline set out by Congress. They released the aid. The Ukrainians didn't start any investigations. They also got a meeting with President Trump. And President Trump doesn't have to meet with foreign leaders, and he still agreed to meet with them. Article 2, Section 4 of the United States Constitution says, the President, Vice President, and all officers shall be removed from office on impeachment for conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. We do not have that here. In every impeachment, Congress has interpreted this section to mean that the President has committed an actual criminal act, one that is outlined in a criminal statute. For example, Nixon, he was accused of a criminal act. Bill Clinton, 3. These were crimes that, if not tried in the House of Representatives, could have been tried in a criminal court. This standard of criminality provides clarity, and as one witness who testified before this committee, Mr. Turley, explained, although criminality is not required, clarity is necessary. That comes from a complete and comprehensive record that eliminates exculpatory motivations or explanations. But throughout this investigation, the Democrats couldn't seem to find any criminal act on the part of the president. So instead of relying on historical precedent of criminality, they decided to impeach him for abuse of power, a vague phrase that appears nowhere in the Constitution when discussing impeachment. It has no basis in fact or in evidence, but rather is deeply rooted in personal opinion and perception. Mr. Turley also explained the implications of this occurrence, quote, we have never impeached a president solely or even largely on the basis of a non-criminal abuse of power allegation. There is good reason for that unbroken record. Abuses of power tend to be even less defined and more debatable as a basis for impeachment than some of the crimes already mentioned. He went on to say that the principal problem with proving an abuse of power theory is the lack of direct evidence due to the failure to compel key witnesses to testify or production of key documents. Now let's talk about the direct evidence that they have. There is none. The only person that would have firsthand knowledge of the quid pro quo, bribery, extortion, or whatever buzzword the Democrats want to trot out next is President Zelensky, who has categorically denied any such agreement or pressure. Herein lies the issue with hinging your entire impeachment on a non-criminal abuse of power allegation. The facts don't support your claims. So let's review. Never in the history of the United States has a president been impeached solely or largely on the basis of abuse of power. Every president who has been impeached for criminal acts. Democrats found no evidence of criminal misconduct on the part of the president. The Democrats have even failed to even prove a non-criminal standard for abuse of power and have relied on hearsay and conjecture. What the Democrats are trying to do here is pull the wool over the eyes of the American people and make them think that wrongdoing has occurred where there is none. By using fancy rhetoric and flowery language, they think that they can convince a nation of their ill-conceived ideas. Don't fall for it, America. I yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. If the Democrats are going to take some of Sondland, you got to take all of Sondland. You're going to mention him 611 times in your report. If you're going to build your case around the guy who presumed there was a quid pro quo, the guy who had to file an addendum to his deposition, if you're going to do all that, you can't ignore the direct conversation he had with the President of the United States, where he asked him, Mr. President, what do you want from Ukraine? What did the President say? Interesting, Mr. Sondland left this out of his opening statement, his 20-some page opening statement. What do you want from Ukraine? What did the President say? I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. I want him to do what he said. I want him to do what he ran on. You can't ignore that. The one piece of direct evidence, you want all this presumption, you want all this addendum, If you're going to take some asylum, you got to take all of them. I yield back. I yield to Mr. Stupi.
I yield to
Mr. Stubbe's
Mr.
time.
Gates.
There's
I had 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
I had 30 seconds left before they cut the clock.
The gentleman proceed.
I yield to Mr. Gates.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just think the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen's debate on the last subject really shows what we're dealing with. This is not a rifle shot impeachment with facts and evidence. This is birdshot. I mean, he talked about everything from, you know, the campaign finance concerns to Trump University, concerns about charities. This is like pin the tail on your favorite impeachment theory because they don't have evidence for any one single thing to impeach the president for. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. McClintock seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, the Constitution introduces the President with 15 words. The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. It does not vest any authority in lieutenant colonels at the NSC, ambassadors, State Department officials, or cabinet secretaries. The only authority that these officials exercise is delegated to them by the President. So all of the criticisms and resentments and personal and political disagreements that we've heard from those officials are completely irrelevant. It is dangerous that so many officials in the executive branch believe that they have independent authority to override presidential policy, leak classified documents, and actively work to undermine the lawful discharge of the president's duties under Article 2. If their judgment can replace that of the president, it means that the people of the United States have simply been removed from the equation. Now, someone said during the discussion today that the president has actually committed real crimes. But the article does not charge such crimes. Why not? Because there's no evidence to support them. If there was evidence, you know that in a heartbeat they would have included these charges, so it's obvious they don't even believe their own rhetoric. One member said, we're not restricted as the Department of Justice is. Think about what that statement means. The Department of Justice is restricted by the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights sets forth basic principles of due process, the right to confront your accuser, the right to call witnesses in your defense. Charges have to be supported by evidence, not gossip, and you have the right to appeal to the courts to protect these rights. Yes, the Department of Justice is restricted by the Bill of Rights, but our Bill of Rights, with its due process restrictions, restricts all of us who take the oath of office, and that includes Congress. We are restricted to respect these rights also. Only the majority is now placing themselves above the supreme law of the land. The lawful exercise of executive power is simply not an impeachable offense. The president is responsible for faithfully executing the laws. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act makes it a crime to offer something of value to secure business in a foreign country. Well, the facts of Mr. Biden's actions in the Ukraine certainly look like they crossed that line. Does the president have the authority to request cooperation of a foreign government to investigate potentially corrupt interactions between U.S. officials and their own officials? Of course he does. The Democrats impute the most sinister motives to this request. Well, nothing in the conversation suggests that. Do us a favor because our country has been through a lot and Ukraine knows a lot about it. That's the exact quote. Now, the National Defense Authorization Act specifically requires the administration to determine that Ukraine is taking steps to combat corruption before aid can be released. Now, the Democrats have made much of the fact that the Secretary of Defense certified this in May. They ignore two facts. Number one, the Secretary of Defense exercises no authority independent of the President. The buck still stops at the President's desk. And two, the President retains responsibility to determine that the findings of his administration remain valid, particularly as he assesses the intention of a newly elected president and newly elected parliament. And lest we forget, last year, 3 Democratic senators wrote to the Ukrainian government demanding that it cooperate in investigating President Trump. The Democrats found absolutely nothing objectionable about this. The only difference I see is that the president actually has the authority and the responsibility to make such a request. So what's at stake here? The worst possible interpretations of the president's motives in discharging his constitutional powers are being imputed to him by his most vitriolic opponents. Now, there's nothing extraordinary about that. It's called politics. But if this can become the new standard of impeachment, that Congress can impeach any president whose motives his opponents question, if this is allowed to replace treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors as the standard for nullifying a national election and substituting the judgment of Congress instead of the judgment of the American people, well, then no president can make any decision without subjecting the nation to the travesty going on today. The executive branch will be subordinated to the legislative, serving at the pleasure of Congress, and the separation of powers at the heart of our Constitution will have been utterly destroyed. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the ranking member, Mr. Collins, seek recognition?
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we've went through this amendment, which I think is probably one of the most telling amendments, and when put to a vote is going to tell a lot, because this is the most amorphous amendment that you could have. This is the one that even when I was waiting for the announcement from the chairman and others at the podium, I was actually there and was being interviewed. And when I heard this one come up and confirm that abuse of power was one of their articles of impeachment, it was simply stunning. And my first reaction has been made and rung true completely here today by many of the members on the majority, including the gentleman from Tennessee just recently, who just confirmed it. Abuse of power for article of impeachment means anything they want it to mean. It is the carte blanche coverage. It's saying, we don't really have a case to our caucus, but go out and make it up. Just go out and say what you don't like. If he didn't say something nice to this, if he didn't do a policy you don't like, do this and that's going to cover you. You'll be okay. Because remember, this is always about an election. You know how we continue to know this? We keep misquoting the transcript. They don't have the facts, so we keep misquoting the transcript, saying, do me a favor. Again, it's simple. Read it. It's us, our country. I mean, if you've got a case, make it, but don't make it up because you don't have it. What we have here also is this continual, just repeated attacks on the Ukrainian President, Mr. Zelensky. The repeated attacks. Because we're either claiming he is a liar or a puppet, or as we just called, he's a politician and an actor, so disregard him. Wow, that's a lot of concern for the Ukrainian people, taking on their very president they've just elected. When we understand and we look at this, this is how it gets to the problem. When you get to a certain point and you can't make your case, when you can't factually add it up, when you have law school professors tell you, well, if you think this, then the inference is okay, then we've lowered the standard to where anything can be brought in. The factual case that has just been made over the past almost 3 hours now by the minority side has laid bare the case on abuse of power. There is none. You can make it up, you can call it whatever you want, and you can go try and sell that to the American people, but they're not buying it. They're not. And it's going to get harder and harder for members to actually go to that well next week, or go to that ballot where they actually stick their card in and vote yes on abuse of power, and then actually have to go back and explain that. It's easy in this room. You got help from your colleagues, but when you're back home trying to explain why you're going to take down a president duly elected over abuse of power because of some of the arguments we've heard this morning, that's just amazing. There is true skepticism about what went on in the Ukraine, and it's deeply rooted with this president. And by the way, there was another time in the late 17 and early 18, Ukraine aid was held. It's not the first time. Skeptical of foreign aid. He ran on this. I've said this before. Most people are amazed that he actually does what he said he's going to do. He runs on campaigns that our foreign aid needs to be looked at. He actually does those kind of things. That's what a president and true leadership does. The pause was for 55 days. Also, other countries' aid was also held. Lebanon was actually held. Others were actually held. This is not a new thing. Do not let the majority try to convince the American people that withholding aid or not looking into corruption is a new thing. Don't let them do it. In the words, like I said, others, maybe that's what, when you're having to play a part, you have to do that. You have to make it up. It's called ad lib, and that's what they're doing. Mr. Hale testified, one of the more egregious ones, and I have a friend of mine who texted me just a few minutes ago. Mr. Stubbe's brought this up, I brought this up, but again, it needs to be hit. One of the things perpetrated this morning out to the American people is that people lost their lives in the Ukraine over this held aid. This friend of mine who texted me just a few minutes ago lost limbs on his own body in defense of our country in a war zone. And he says, don't let them get away with this because this is a future act. Mr. Hale testified to this fact. In fact, he repeated it in his deposition. We want to talk about facts? Go to the deposition. Go to the transcript that he had. He said this was future aid, had nothing to do with running the army right then. In war zones, people get hurt and people die, and Russia has invaded Ukraine. They are fighting that. It is a hot war. People will. But to blame this conversation because you have such a weak case that you're going to try and throw that in just to scare the American people, that's not right. Make a case, have your facts, put it in the articles. But when you can't do that, you go in the back room, you start writing articles of impeachment, and you say, uh-oh, we got a problem. Let's put something in there that all of our conference can get behind because they don't like the president. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Dean seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to speak in opposition to this amendment and to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to remind you of the facts that have been uncovered and to review them and put them on the record again for the American public because facts do matter. Notice the contrast between the conversation on this side of the aisle and that. They run away from the facts. They're afraid to admit to themselves or to the American public of what the president's behavior really adds up to. So let me just recite the facts. When Ukrainian President Zelensky raised the issue of U.S. military assistance to Ukraine during the July 25th call, President Trump replied, quote, "I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot and Ukraine knows a lot about that," end quote. Congress appropriated and authorized $391 million in security assistance to Ukraine. On May 23rd, the Department of Defense certified to Congress that Ukraine had completed the requisite anti-corruption reform actions to qualify for the security assistance appropriated by Congress. The President himself directed the aid to be put on hold. In July, Ukrainian officials asked Pentagon staff about the hold on military assistance. No legitimate public policy or national security rationale exists, and the President has not brought one forward for President Trump's decision to withhold the security assistance from Ukraine. Providing aid to Ukraine is in the national security interest of the United States. Withholding it is in the personal political interest of the President and of Putin. President Trump failed to say the word corruption during his April 21st call with President Zelensky. President Trump failed to say the word corruption during his July 25th call to President Zelensky. The aid to Ukraine was released only after House committees announced an investigation into the administration's decision to halt the aid. The President instructed all witnesses from the administration not to testify and withheld all relevant documents from House investigators. On October 3rd, when asked by a reporter what he hoped President Zelensky would do following their July 25th call, President Trump told the American public and the world, well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer. On October 17th at a press briefing in the White House, Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney said President Trump absolutely mentioned corruption related to the DNC server in connection with the security assistance during his July 25th call, and that server was part of, quote, why we held the money up, end quote. Upon taking a question from a reporter attempting to clarify the acknowledgement of a quid pro quo, Mulvaney replied, quote, we do that all the time with foreign policy. Get over it. Let me remind you of a statement that Dr. Fiona Hill made in her opening statement and her extraordinary, powerful opening statement, incredible testimony before this Congress. She said, and I quote, if the President or anyone else impedes or subverts the national security of the United States in order to further a domestic, political, or personal interests, that is more than worthy of your attention. I ask my colleagues respectfully on the other side of this dais, is it not worthy of our attention to uphold the Constitution and ask the President to do the same? Or do they think it is proper? Do they think it's okay for any president, not just this one, but for any president to invite foreign interference into our elections? And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield to the gentleman from Rhode Island.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Chairman, there's a letter that was signed by more than 500 legal scholars across the ideological spectrum that I'd like to just read from very briefly. Speaking of the President's conduct, they say, the President's conduct is precisely the type of threat to our democracy that the founders feared when they included the remedy of impeachment in the Constitution. We take no position on whether the President committed a crime, but conduct need not be criminal to be impeachable. The standard here is constitutional. It does not depend on what Congress has chosen to criminalize. They go on to say impeachment is an especially essential remedy for conduct that corrupts elections. I know that my time is about to expire, so I'll come back to this before I introduce it, because I'd like to read some additional parts of it. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I recognize myself on the amendment, and I yield to Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like just to continue to read, because this, again, is a letter signed by more than 500 constitutional scholars. And I think some of the confusion my colleagues have been struggling with is the difference between impeachable offenses and violations of the criminal statute. So I hope this will help clarify that. They write, impeachment is a remedy for grave abuses of the public trust. Impeachment is an especially essential remedy for conduct that corrupts elections. The primary check on a president is political. If a president behaves poorly, voters can punish him or her at the polls. A president who corrupts the system of elections seeks to place himself beyond the reach of this political check. As the Constitutional Convention, George Mason described impeachable offenses as attempts to subvert the Constitution. Corrupting elections subverts the process by which the Constitution makes the president democratically accountable. Put simply, if a president cheats in his effort at re-election, trusting the democratic process to serve as a check through that election is no remedy at all. This is what an impeachment is for. They go on to say in this letter, whether President Trump's conduct is classified as bribery, as a high crime or misdemeanor, or both, it is clearly impeachable under our Constitution. So in asking that unanimous consent that this letter and the more than 500 legal scholars assigned to be made part of the record, I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will understand the basis of this article of impeachment, that the President of the United States violated the public trust, undermined the national security of the United States, betrayed our national interests by using the enormous power of his office, not to advance the public good, not to advance the policies of the United States and the interests of the United States, but to advance his own personal political benefit. That is exactly what the framers spoke about. That's not my conclusion alone. It was the conclusion of the scholars we heard from in our hearing and more than 500 legal scholars that have joined them. And so I hope we'll put to rest this notion that you have to violate a criminal statute. You know, a president could deface a post office, a mailbox. That's a federal crime. No one would suggest the president could be impeached for that. So the framers are talking about the abuses of the public trust, a violation of the most sacred oath to honor the interests of the American people and not advance your own personal political interests. These constitutional scholars say it much better than I can, and as well as Professor Raskin has said, so I ask unanimous consent to be made part of the record.
Without objection. Reclaiming my time, I would simply point out a few things. Number one, that the impeachment of President Nixon, although he had committed many crimes, he was impeached. The committee voted impeachment for abuse of power and obstruction of justice. It did not specify a specific crime. I would also point out that the majority staff report of the Judiciary Committee back in 1974, not just now, and I believe in 1998, but certainly 1974, pointed out that crimes and impeachable offenses are different things. There are crimes which may not be impeachable. There are impeachable offenses which may not be crimes. An impeachable offense, a high crime and misdemeanor, is a grave and serious offense against the Constitution, against the structure and function of government. I would refer you to the Federalist Papers. I would also say one other thing. We've repeatedly heard that the Democrats are accusing President Zelensky and Mr. Yermak of lying because President Zelensky said he wasn't pressured. Well, of course he said he wasn't pressured. The United States is a powerful nation on which his nation is dependent. He has a gun to his head. The gun is the fact that the President of the United States, upon whom he depends for military aid, for help in many different ways, has shown himself willing to withhold that aid and to do other things based on what he says, based on what he's willing to play along with the President for his personal political goals. So of course he denies he was pressured, because he knows that if he didn't deny that, there might be heavy consequences to pay, and you cannot credit that denial. And you cannot credit that denial without any aspersions on his character, but simply on the fact that the President of the United States holds a gun to his head. I yield back, and the question is on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Roll call.
Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler? No. Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? No. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? No. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass? Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Richmond? Mr. Jeffries? No. Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell?
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Demings? Ms. Demings votes no. Mr. Correa? No. Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath?
No.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Mucarsel-Powell?
No.
Ms. Mucarsel-Powell votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Sensenbrenner votes aye. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Radcliffe? Mr. Radcliffe votes yes. Ms. Roby?
Aye.
Ms. Roby votes aye. Mr. Gates?
Aye.
Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock?
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Ms. Lesko? Ms. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler votes aye. Mr. Klein?
Aye.
Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Armstrong?
Yes.
Mr. Armstrong votes yes. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Stubbe votes yes.
Are there any members who wish to vote who haven't voted? The clerk will report.
Mr. Richmond, you are not recorded.
No.
Mr. Richmond votes no.
Are there any other members who haven't voted who wish to vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 17 ayes and 23 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman.
Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentleman has an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment. The gentlelady reserves a point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.Res. 755, offered by Mr. Gates of Florida. Page 3, strike lines 10 through 11, and insert the following. A well-known corrupt company, Burisma, and its corrupt hiring of Hunter Biden, and.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment strikes the reference to Joe Biden as the center of the proposed investigation and replaces it with the true topic of the investigation, Burisma and Hunter Biden. An essential element of the Democrats' case on abuse of power is that the Bidens did nothing wrong. It can only be an abuse of power and not a correct use of power if the president was pursuing something under which there was no reasonable basis to ask a question about Hunter Biden and Burisma. Hunter Biden and Burisma, well, that's an interesting story. And I think just about every American knows there's something up with that. $86,000 a month, no experience, working for some foreign government while your dad's the vice president of the United States. Is there anyone who believes this is okay? I know we got a few of my Democrat colleagues maybe run for president or might run for president one day. Would you let your vice president have their son or daughter or family member out moonlighting for some foreign company? Maybe I'll use language familiar to the former vice president. Come on, man. This looks dirty as it is. Hunter Biden was making more than 5 times more than a board member for ExxonMobil. I've heard of that company. And so I went to read up on Hunter Biden, learn a little more about him, and I found this very extensive profile in the New Yorker. And here's what it says. Hunter said that at that point, he had not slept for several days. Driving east on Interstate 10 just beyond Palm Springs, he lost control of his car, which jumped the median and skidded to a stop on the shoulder of the westbound side. He called Hertz, which came to collect the damaged car and gave him a second rental. The Hertz rental officer told me he found a crack pipe in the car and on one of the consoles a line of white powder residue. Beau Biden's Attorney General badge was on the dashboard. Hertz called the Prescott Police Department and officers filed a narcotics offense report listing items seized in the car, including a plastic bag containing white powdery substance, a Secret Service business card, credit cards, and Hunter Biden's driver's license. That is what we would call evidence. And I don't want to make light of anybody's substance abuse issues. I know the president's working real hard to solve those throughout the country, but it's a little hard to believe that Burisma hired Hunter Biden to resolve their international disputes when he could not resolve his own dispute with Hertz rental car over leaving cocaine and a crack pipe in the car. It continues. Hunter stayed in Los Angeles for about a week. He said that he needed to get away and forget sooner after his arrival in L.A. He said he asked a homeless man in Pershing Square where he could buy crack. Hunter said that the man took him to a nearby homeless encampment where a narrow passageway between tents, someone put a gun to his head before realizing that he was the buyer. He returned to buy more crack a few times that week. Again, not saying, not casting any judgment on any challenges someone goes through in their personal life, but it is just hard to believe that this was the guy wandering through homeless encampments buying crack that was worth $86,000 a month to Burisma Holding. And that might be one of the reasons why when ABC asked Hunter Biden, hey, you think you would have gotten this job in the absence of your dad being the vice president? Well, he said, probably not. And then I looked to the record evidence, and I looked at the testimony of Mr. Kent. Mr. Kent was one of the witnesses they called on the first day. He said Burisma was so dirty that our own embassy had to pull out of a joint sponsorship with them. When Ambassador Yovanovitch was being prepped for her Senate confirmation, the Obama administration was so worried about the corruption around Burisma and Hunter Biden that they held special prep moments to try to get ready for the inevitable questions about this obvious corruption that the president asked about. Mr. Kent, again, one of their witnesses from the first day, also gave testimony that that the head of Burisma had stolen $23 million in the U.S. and the U.K., and that he paid a bribe to get off the hook. So again, it's not as if Burisma is pulling out new plays. Their playbook is to do dirty stuff and then go and pay bribes and hire the people necessary to make those problems go away. This is why the minority hearing issue is so important, by the way. You wonder why Republicans are so angry that we didn't have a hearing to put on our own witnesses and own evidence. And you may wonder why, well, if they feel so good about their case, why did they block our ability to put in evidence? It's because we have the ability to show that Burisma is corrupt. We have the ability to show that Hunter Biden is corrupt. And that totally exculpates the president. Because there is no way in the United States of America that honestly pursuing actual corruption is an impeachable offense. That's why I offer the amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to vote for it.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my point of order.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Johnson seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to this amendment, and I would say that the pot calling the kettle black is not something that we should do. I don't know what members, if any, have had any problems with substance abuse, been busted in DUI. I don't know. But if I did, I wouldn't raise it against anyone on this committee. I don't think it's proper. And you know, I think we got to get back down to what is most important here. This is a question that stands out like a big, throbbing, sore toe inside of a shoe that's too small. And that is this question: is it ever okay for a president of the United States of America to invite foreign interference in an upcoming presidential election campaign?
Is the gentleman seeking an answer?
Is the gentleman yield?
Oh, I'll be glad to answer.
The silence. Gentleman has the time.
The silence
People respond.
was and is deafening. And there'll be plenty of time for you to respond to that question, and I would invite you to do so. I gave you an opportunity of about 10 or 15 seconds while you could get your story together, and nobody came up with a story. So I'm going to let you move to strike the last word and explain that to the American people. It's never proper for a United States president to hold a foreign country over a barrel to make them do that president's personal bidding and holding needed security assistance, dangling it, and dangling the fact that I'll give it to you if you do this. I mean, that's exactly what happened. It's like the American people understand what happened. Those are the facts. The president said it when he released the transcript of the summary of that phone call on July 25th. The summary of the president's own words shows that the president tried to get President Zelensky to interfere in the upcoming presidential election. That is established by the facts. So this is not about Hunter Biden, and they've said that on the other side repeatedly up until they start talking about Hunter Biden having some substance abuse problems. You can't have it both ways. Let's be honest. This is about our conscience, the conscience of the nation, the conscience of my friends on the other side of the aisle. Do you believe that we should allow this to go unaddressed, what the president did? Because we are a country of precedent. We are a country of rule of law. We are a country of norms and traditions. Are we going to allow the violation of our norms, our traditions, our legal precedent? Because after all, bribery was not a crime. There was no criminal code when the framers passed the Constitution, but they said bribery in there, and what bribery meant was I'm offering you something if you do something for me. I'll give you this. In other words, you give me this, I'll give you that. That's what we had in this case. That's what bribery means. It doesn't depend on a statute. It depends on what we know was done. And so let's not get bogged down in technicalities and in character assassination. Let's keep our eye on what really happened in this case and whether or not our consciences dictate that we do something about it. We can't let it go unaddressed. And the way that we deal with this grave abuse of the public trust is with the drastic action that it requires, because this is a drastic circumstance. The drastic action is impeachment, and that's why we're here today. And I ask my colleagues to let your conscience be your guide. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Sensen, for what purposes, Mr. Sensenbrenner?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, my mind is boggled by the gentleman from Georgia saying that all bribery was okay until 1787 when the Constitution was adopted, and 2 years later when Congress passed the first criminal code. First of all, there's a common law definition of bribery. I think people long before 1787 realized that bribery was no good, but we also had criminal codes in each of the 13 independent states, colonies, before the Declaration of Independence.
Will the gentleman answer my question?
No, I didn't interrupt you.
The gentleman has the time.
Okay. The second thing is that if you, on the other side of the aisle, believe that Joe Biden is a man who tells the truth, you ought to support this amendment. Because Joe Biden, ever since Hunter's involvement with Burisma, has been repeatedly asked whether he made any arrangements to get Hunter this really cushy job. And he said no, or my son's business involvements are my son's and not involved in that. So you put Joe Biden's name in your articles of impeachment when the real malefactor is Hunter Biden. Hunter's not running for anything, and if the real malefactor really is Hunter Biden, I guess your claim that the president was trying to influence the 2020 election would go out the window. But if you think that Joe Biden is a man who tells the truth, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt because I think he deserves it, then let's get rid of Joe Biden in this article of impeachment, substitute his son's name in there, and proceed. I challenge you, because every one of you that will vote no on this amendment is going to be saying, I think that Joe Biden's a liar. If you don't think that Joe Biden is a liar, vote yes. I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, it's important to analyze the burden of proof here. It's the Democrats who are saying any question about the Biden situation, Burisma, it could only be an abuse of power. And I think this amendment really reflects how the president was using his power perfectly, entirely appropriately. And it also shows how scared they are of the facts. If we had the opportunity to call in those who were engaged in work with the Ukrainian embassy, folks like Alexander Chalupa, if we were able to bring forward Hunter Biden, if we were able to demonstrate the bias of the whistleblower, the American people would see we are not in this debate and in this discussion because the president did anything wrong or impeachable or criminal. We're here fundamentally because they cannot accept the fact that he won the 2016 election. And I think all Americans know the president has a different approach. But to accept their standard would mean that if someone announces that they're running for office, it's kind of like an instant immunity deal for anything that they would ever do. I mean, are they really saying that if Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, Burisma were engaged in some corrupt act, that just because Joe Biden announced for the presidency, that somehow ought to absolve him of that criminal activity? It's a ludicrous position. Maybe it's informed by the fact that y'all got a little lucky on the Hillary Clinton stuff. You know, she thought that because she was in a presidential election that her crimes didn't have to be held to account. And in a way, that turned out to be the case. But you know what? It shouldn't be the standard in the United States of America. And I'm glad that we have a president who is at times skeptical of foreign aid, who does put America first, who understands that in corrupt places, the resources we provide don't always make it to an area of need. But we conclude with this. Once the meetings happened that demonstrated that President Zelensky was a true reformer, that he wasn't corrupt, that he was honest from the point of his campaign all the way up until the point when he said there was no pressure put on him or his government for this aid. If you accept that proposition, it's very clear the president was entirely appropriate in those questions. And I got to say, in debate on the last amendment, now we have reached the point in time where President Trump isn't the only president being attacked in this hearing. I heard the gentleman from Tennessee go after Zelensky as, well, an actor, a politician. And they presume he's a liar when he says there was nothing wrong. You know what? They can't make the case against the president.
My name was called.
They're attacking Zelensky, and it just shows the absurdity of the endeavor.
His time has expired. For what purpose does Ms. Jackson Lee seek recognition?
I was asking if I could respond as my name was, as I was called.
No. For what purpose does Ms. Jackson Lee seek recognition?
I rise to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the chairman. This is about distraction, distraction, distraction. Our good friends spent 3 hours saying President did not target the Bidens. Now they're saying that he did. So which is it? Now I'm holding the classified, unclassified conversation, and let me just clarify a certain point. And that point is that I did read the transcript, and it did say us. But there is nothing in the president's notes that even suggested that the question that he asked was for the American people. In testimony by Mr. Goldman, who obviously went through every aspect of this, I asked a question about whether or not the president said anything from the notes that are given, the briefing that is given by those representatives of the United States government, the staff of the National Security Council, the State Department, the Defense Department, on corruption. He didn't speak anything about corruption that he was briefed on. And if you go through the call, he continues to mention the Bidens. And so this, again, is about Ukraine. The president did ask Ukraine, the president of Ukraine, a vulnerable leader of a country that is fledgling and trying to survive. Now, let me say that I intend to introduce into the record an article that indicated very clearly that people did die. Trump froze military aid as Ukrainian soldiers perished in battle, LA Times. I ask unanimous consent to submit that into the record. But the facts are, President Trump provided $510 million in aid in 2017 and $359 million in 2018. But he wanted to stop in 2019, the year or months before the 2020 election. In addition, President Trump's advisors confirmed that President Trump's investigations, the 2016 election interference and the Bidens, were not U.S. policy. And as well, they have debunked any association that there was anything to the impropriety of the former vice president and his service as it related to Ukraine. I think it is also important the Department of Defense and State Department have confirmed that Ukraine had met all anti-corruption benchmarks and the aid should be released. That's the policy of the United States of America. There was no need for this president to, in essence, try to make up his own policy. In his own statement of administrative policies, and I ask unanimous consent to have those in the record, this is from the White House. Nothing in this said to discuss corruption. Why? Because Ukraine had already met the standards of independent executive agencies, that they had met that standard of corruption. Their money should have been released. And we well know, as the process of the whistleblower and the timing, that President Zelensky, desperate for money, people dying in the field, was asked to do a CNN announcement. And he was going to be on one of CNN's well-known shows dealing with international politics. But it was stopped in its tracks, as testified by witnesses under oath, because of the whistleblower statement. Let me be very clear, there is some representation of crime, crime, crime. First of all, our scholars indicated that these are impeachable offenses. The conduct of the president is impeachable, and there's enough evidence to show. But as I indicated yesterday, this, my friends, is a legal document, the Constitution. It is a legal document. You can breach and violate the law of the Constitution. There are constitutional crimes. And the vastness of the impeachment process does include the excess of power by the President of the United States. Now, I knew Barbara Jordan, and my friends wanted to quote her. She also said The framers confided in the Congress the power, if need be, to remove a president in order to strike a delicate balance between a president swollen with power and grown tyrannical and preservation of the independence of the executive. You can violate the crimes of the Constitution. Abuse of power includes that. This amendment should be defeated.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Mr. Chair,
For what purpose does Mr. Ratcliffe seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank the chair. I want to answer my colleague from Georgia, Mr. Johnson's question that he asked before. Is it ever okay to invite a foreign government to become involved in an election involving a political opponent? The answer is yes. It better be. We do it all the time. Have you that quickly forgotten how the Trump-Russia investigation proceeded? The Obama administration asked Great Britain and Italy and Australia and other countries to assist in its investigation of a person who was a political opponent from the opposite party. I keep hearing over and over again, you can't investigate political opponents. We have a member of this committee who was, as a member of this committee and the Intelligence Committee, investigating his political opponent, Donald Trump, at the very moment he was running to replace him as president. My colleague on the Intel Committee, Mr. Castro, was investigating President Trump at the very same moment his brother was running to replace President Trump. President Trump is the only one with the really legitimate reason to be doing it. He is the chief executive. Chief executive, we are in the Judiciary Committee, right? We do understand the Constitution. We do understand that the president, as the unitary executive, is the executive branch. And all power in the executive branch derives from the president. And the president can and should ask for assistance from foreign governments in ongoing criminal investigations. There was an ongoing criminal investigation into what happened in 2016. The Attorney General Barr, at the time of the July 25th call, had long before that appointed U.S. Attorney John Durham to investigate exactly that issue. It wasn't just appropriate, it was absolutely the president's constitutional duty. And Hunter Biden, the president has, as the chief executive, the ability to ask about matters where there is a prima facie case of corruption. What do we have with respect to Hunter Biden? Tons of money for a position where he has no Ukrainian experience, where he has no experience with Ukraine or with energy, and at the very same time that the Ukrainians were deciding that Hunter Biden was the perfect person to get that sweetheart deal, the Chinese were deciding that Hunter Biden was the perfect person to get a sweetheart deal to manage $1.5 billion in financial assets. And when the Ukrainian government wanted to investigate corruption, like we all keep talking about they need to, well, they start investigating Burisma, and what happens? Joe Biden says, you better fire that prosecutor investigating corruption into Burisma, or you're not going to get $1 billion. And 6 hours later, that's what happened. That's called influence peddling. That is a crime. And there is a prima facie case of that. And it's absolutely appropriate for a president to ask about that. I yield to my friend.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just want to respond to the comments from the gentlelady from Texas. She said the president made up his own policy. Well, that's how it works in our country. You get your name on a ballot, you run for office, you go talk to the American people, they evaluate it all on election day, they decide who they want making the policy. That's how it works in our country. It's not the unelected people telling the elected individual how we do things, because the unelected people aren't directly accountable to we the people. It's what makes our system the best, the greatest. And when you turn that on its head, that's when you get problems. And we saw it happen, because we heard Chuck Schumer say on January 3rd, 2017, When you mess with the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you. Now, that is a scary statement because that is saying the unelected people can get back at the person who put their name on a ballot and got elected to high office, the highest office in this situation. So for someone in the United States Congress to say the president made up his own policy and somehow that is wrong, that should be a frightening position to take. But I guess that's where the Democrats are today in their quest to go after this president, making statements like that, statements by our colleague and statements by Senator Schumer. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does Ms. Lofgren seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
You know, there are issues for the election, and then there are issues for this committee. The behavior of Vice President Biden's son, and frankly, the behavior of President Trump's 2 sons and daughter may be discussed in the election. But here, we're talking about the abuse of presidential authority. The president must take care that the laws be faithfully executed. We know from the emails from the State Department to the Department of Defense that the Ukrainians knew that the aid was being withheld. That's documentary evidence. We also know that whatever was going on that people might not like with the vice president's son and the vice president, that was known in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018. It wasn't until Vice President Biden was beating President Trump in the polls that this issue was raised to try and force a foreign country to invent an investigation to be used politically. That is not seeing that the laws are faithfully executed. That is an abuse of presidential authority. And I would yield now to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
And I think from my friend from California, it's been about 3 hours since I made this point. I guess it needs to be made from time to time. We just can't simply allow the mischaracterization and the misstatement of the rules, the history of the rules, and House resolutions to advance political arguments here. We can't stand for it. And so I want to address again these statements that there was some right to have witnesses come in. It is absolutely true that that's the case. Over 50 years ago, when the rule was written, when Rule 6 was written, it said it's normal procedure for witnesses representing both sides of the issue to give testimony at committee hearings. And that's what happened at the December 4th meeting. And that's what happened at the December 9th meeting. Let's be honest about the rules. And House Resolution 660, I would point out again, provides an opportunity for the President of the United States to come. He could have come on December 4th. He could have sent any of his witnesses. And he didn't. But no one should be surprised, because that's been the President's approach throughout, is to refuse to allow anyone with the kind of information that my colleagues claim they're interested in from coming to testify, from coming to answer questions directly. And with that, I yield to my friend from New York, Mr. Jeffries.
I thank the distinguished gentleman from Florida. There were 12...
It's my time. I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from New York.
Thank the distinguished gentlelady from California. There were 12 fact witnesses who testified during the Intel hearing. 12. And we don't hear a thing about those witnesses from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. A thing. Those witnesses were not political operatives. They were patriots. In fact, they were Trump appointees. Ambassador Taylor, Trump appointee. Ambassador Sondland, Trump appointee. Dr. Fiona Hill, Trump appointee. Jennifer Williams, Trump appointee. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, Trump appointee. Ambassador Volker, Trump appointee. They all confirmed that Donald Trump pressured a foreign government to target an American citizen for political gain, and at the same time withheld, without justification, $391 million in military aid, undermining America's national security. Let's just look at Ambassador Volker's testimony. He testified about the issue of raising the 2016 elections or Vice President Biden, or these things that I consider to be conspiracy theories. What was his response? It was pretty simple. Quote, I think the allegations against Vice President Biden are self-serving and not credible. That's what this is all about. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Gomer seek recognition?
Support of the amendment. Speaking.
Does the gentleman desire to strike the last word?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized.
It's amazing. We're hearing from the same people accusing us of covering up, not willing to face the truth. They're the same arguments that we've been hearing for 3 years now. First, it was accusing us of not being willing to face the facts about Russia collusion and the president scheming with Russia, and that turned out all to be lies. We were right, and those accusing us of not facing the truth were the ones who were not facing the truth. We heard about all kinds of other allegations, and we said, wait, that doesn't appear to be supported. Well, we weren't facing the truth, and there was a lot of media support for those positions, but we still persisted that we were the ones that were right. And this week, these things are all being borne out. We were right, they were wrong, and now we're not hearing anybody come in and say, hey, we're really sorry when we accused y'all of being crazy and not facing the truth. You were right, there was no Russia collusion. You were right, there was no extortion. And my friends across the aisle keep changing the subject. What the call made clear is we're interested in finding out about if there was Ukrainian collusion or interference in our election. Now, it's amazing how the majority can take two positions that counterindicate each other. First of all, they say there was no effort by Republicans, including President Trump, to stop interference from foreign countries. We hear that over and over, including yesterday and today. And yet the only way to step up and do what President Obama refused to do, if you remember, President Obama belittled President Trump, candidate Trump, for saying he was concerned about outside interference. And in fact, President Obama made a mockery of anybody that was so stupid that they thought somebody like Russia or others might interfere and affect our election. He made fun of them. He wouldn't do anything about outside interference because apparently he must have thought the outside interference was going to help Hillary Clinton. As we've heard, there apparently are some people that certainly are accused in Ukraine of doing all they could to help Hillary Clinton. In fact, it was unheard of to have a foreign ambassador in our country step up and come out with support for Hillary Clinton. So what we continue to see is projecting. Somebody on their side engages in illegal or improper conduct, and that's what they accuse President Trump or us of doing. And all of this self-righteousness about, for political purposes, I mean, this is from a transcript from December 1st, 1943, when President Roosevelt was talking to Marshal Stalin. He's talking with Stalin. This is apparently in Tehran, they're meeting. But he wanted to talk to him about internal American politics. And from the stenographers, they say that President Roosevelt said there were in the United States 6 to 7 million Americans of Polish extraction. As a political man, he didn't want to lose their votes, and he was explaining he couldn't go public. He didn't care when basically the Soviet Union took over Poland. He didn't care if they cut down Poland's borders from the east and from the west. And he goes on to say they say jokingly, that when the Soviet armies invade and occupy these areas of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, he did not intend to go to war with the Soviet Union on this point, but he continues to emphasize, some of these things he can't go public with. These kind of things have gone on by Democrats for many decades, and here they come after the one guy. He wants to get to the bottom of 2016 foreign interference. And what do they accuse him of? Of getting foreign interference. No, you can't root out foreign interference until you know what it was. So you can't have it both ways. Well, I guess the Democratic Party can't have it both ways, but this has got to stop before it goes too much further. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Cicilline seek recognition? Oh, I'm sorry. Who would?
We do.
For what purpose does Mr. Shabbat seek recognition?
Strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I said at a previous hearing before this committee that you were investigating the wrong guy, that it should have been Biden or Biden's, that Ukraine was the third most corrupt nation on earth, and that Hunter Biden had just put himself right smack dab in the middle of that corruption, and that even though Democrats and many of their friends in the media would have you believe that this, the Burisma, Biden corruption, that this was all just the vast right-wing conspiracy allegation, when in actuality, it was the Obama administration that raised this issue first. Back in 2015, George Kent reported his concerns about Hunter Biden to the vice president's office, and the former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, sorry about that, said she was coached by the Obama administration on how to answer pesky questions related to Hunter Biden and Burisma that might arise during her Senate confirmation process. And nearly every single witness who testified at the Intelligence Committee impeachment inquiry agreed that Hunter Biden's Burisma deal created, at the very least, the appearance of a conflict of interest. Yet the Democrats on the Intelligence Committee under Chairman Schiff, and now Democrats in this committee, are determined to sweep all this under the rug, ignore it, not let us call witnesses on it, instead rush to impeach this president. You've got the Vice President, Joe Biden, in charge of overseeing our Ukrainian policy, and his son, Hunter Biden, receiving $50,000 a month, even though he had no identifiable expertise in energy or in Ukraine, yet the Democrats wouldn't let us call witnesses or delve into this. And it was interesting that Joe Biden got in an argument with a man at one of his events in Iowa recently. He called the man a liar and challenged him to a push-up contest and spouted off a bunch of other malarkey. And now the committee, this committee is conducting an impeachment investigation against President Trump based on, as Professor Turley put it recently, wafer-thin evidence, and they're ignoring evidence of something that truly doesn't smell right. Wafer-thin evidence. And this was a professor who acknowledged that he had not voted for President Trump. In fact, all four witnesses who testified, none of them had voted for him. But he said wafer-thin evidence. That's what we're being called to impeach a president on. And while we're doing that, there are so many things that are getting ignored. Now, it looks like one thing, the USMCA, a trade deal which is very important to replace NAFTA, it looks like we might actually get that across the finish line. I certainly hope so, because it'll be good for the country. It's bipartisan. But I think if there's anything good to come out of this impeachment, it's probably that actually will get passed, because the Democrats want to show we did something. We did something, because they haven't done much of anything else. Very little has passed into law. We had 68,000 Americans who died from opioid overdoses last year alone. I think it was 70,000 the year before that. And even though the number's gone down a bit, it's not necessarily because we're doing a whole lot better. It's because we actually, because of Narcan, not quite as many people are dying, but there are just as many people that are involved with this scourge, these opioids and other drugs. Our southern border is still a sieve. We have far too many people coming across our southern border. That's something we ought to be able to work on in a bipartisan manner in this committee, to do something about that in our asylum laws, which need to be reformed. We got a $22 trillion debt hanging over our head. The reason I'm mentioning these issues, this committee has jurisdiction over all these things and isn't doing a thing because we've been spending all our time for the last year on impeachment in one form or another. But I have a bill, a balanced budget amendment, which would actually move in the right direction to doing something about that. We should have done it years ago. Those are all in our jurisdiction. Other things like infrastructure, not in our jurisdiction, but the United States Congress ought to act on it. We have our highways and our bridges are crumbling in this country. It's actually something we generally agree on, but the Democrats probably don't want the president to take any credit for that, so that's not likely to happen. It's unfortunate taking up all this time on impeachment when there are so many other things that we ought to be working on for the benefit of the American people.
For what purpose does Mr. Sensenbrenner seek, does Mr. Jordan seek recognition?
Yield to the ranking member.
I want to just take a quick second. It is amazing, though, to hear now they've gotten really sensitive about process on the majority side. When we actually pointed out the tragedy and the travesty of being a rubber stamp in this committee, and the gentleman from Florida has brought out a couple of things. But let me just remind, as he said just a few minutes ago, the White House going to send everything? Nope, it's just like everything else. It all goes through the whim and the whimper of the chairman and the majority. They can't send anybody they want. It all goes through their majority opinion. I give back to the gentleman.
Yield to the gentleman from Florida.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. If Democrats can't prove that the Bidens are clean, then President Trump can't be guilty of abusing power if he's asking a reasonable question. They cannot prove that the questions into the Bidens are unreasonable. Now, the gentleman from New York said, well, you just start listening to the witnesses. I listened very closely to the witnesses. What I heard was Mr. Kent say that they were so concerned about Burisma, we had to pull out of a partnership with the embassy. So if it's okay for our embassy to ask the questions, why isn't it okay for the president? I listened to Ambassador Yovanovitch when she gave testimony. She said that she was having to do special preparation to have to answer these sticky questions about why the vice president's son was off moonlighting for some foreign energy company. So if it's okay for Yovanovitch to ask those questions, if it's okay for the Obama administration to ask those questions, why isn't it okay for President Trump to ask those questions? Here's one thing I know. Corrupt people, they don't just steal once. They kind of get into this like cycle and culture of corruption, and it's disappointing. I go back to this New Yorker article. I'm reading directly from it. One of Kathleen's motions, this is regarding Hunter Biden's divorce, contains a reference to a large diamond that had come into Hunter's possession. When I asked him about it, he told me he had been given the diamond by Chinese energy tycoon Yi Jingmen. Hunter told me that 2 associates accompanied him to his first meeting with Yi in Miami, and they surprised him by giving him a rare vintage of scotch worth thousands of dollars. So this guy wasn't just taking these weird jobs from the Ukrainians. He was taking diamonds and scotch from the Chinese, and I think it is entirely appropriate for the President of the United States to figure out why that's the case. The American people watching today know that this is an impeachment movement that is losing steam. I was watching CNN on the way into the hearing this morning, maybe one of the only folks, but I was watching, and I heard Gloria Borger say, the polling on impeachment is bad for Democrats. I heard Jim Sciutto say that Chairman Nadler had gone on CNN's air and said, well, once we have these public hearings, we will animate all this public support for impeachment. Well, now you've had the hearings, you've called the witnesses, and you know what? You're losing ground. You're losing ground with the media, you're losing ground with the voters, and you're even losing ground among your own Democrat colleagues. I believe the public reporting I've seen that some of your more moderate members in districts that President Trump won are begging you to pursue something other than impeachment. This bloodlust for impeachment is not going to be visited on us or President Trump. It's going to be visited on your own members, and they're asking you not to do this. The only standard that Speaker Pelosi, Chairman Nadler, and Chairman Schiff set was a bipartisan standard. They said this has to be bipartisan. They said it all throughout the 2018 calendar year. But now the only thing that has changed is not a strengthening of the evidence. It's that we're going into an election. And they have taken a look at the candidates that they have in the Democratic field, and they've realized that they have to create this impeachment platform because their candidates are incapable of defeating President Trump in a fair fight. We know that. The American people know that. And so the only bipartisan vote that has occurred on impeachment was a bipartisan vote against opening the inquiry. And the only possibility for movement from that vote to now, despite wasting all our time, despite having all these hearings, despite all the damage to our institutions through this very weird and aberrational investigation you've run, the only risk is that you'll lose more votes than you started with. You lost 2 of your members the first time, and you're not going to lose less than 2 of your members. You only have a risk of losing more than 2 of your members. And you know what? Republicans are united. We see this for what it is. And we know, just as my colleague from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, said, this is not just an attack on President Trump politically, though it is the election that motivates them for this bizarre behavior. It's not just an attack on the presidency. It's an attack on us. It's an attack on those of us who believe in this president, who understand very well who we voted for, and he's got some non-traditional ways of doing business, but we also see the great success of this country. More jobs, more opportunity. They have no answer for that in the upcoming election, and it's why we're here.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Big, for what purposes, Mr. Big seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mentioned before that looking at the evidence, I'm stunned that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle perpetually read every inference you can make in the light most negative to the president, and yet this whole proceedings and the way this has been shaped up indicates that there's an incredible inference against their credibility because of the way they've stacked the cards against the president. So I want to read. I support the gentleman's amendment, and I want to read this from a Ukrainian source who was named and cited in a recent publication. It says, quote, by inviting influential foreigners, Ukrainian business wants to get additional protection, PR and lobby mechanisms to grasp additional spheres of interest. Having Hunter Biden on board, the owner of Burisma wanted to correct the image and to get cover because authorities are scared by the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine. Hunter Biden, using the political capabilities of his family, acted as a rescue buffer between Burisma and Ukrainian law enforcement agencies. His work in the company of a corrupt official smells. Now, so let's take a look at the document, the transcript they keep, our colleagues keep referring to. Page 4, the other thing President Trump says, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution. A lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution. So if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me. That is the essence of what they want to impeach President Trump for. So it begs the question, it simply begs the question, really. Do you get immunity? Is it an immunity granting event to have a relative run for public office? Do you get immunity for that? Let's flip it on its end. The question is, does the president have the authority to request an investigation? Most assuredly. He mentions the Attorney General here. It is clear that he would like an investigation into the corruption surrounding the Ukraine. Because what does President Zelensky go on to say? He goes on to talk about trying to restore the honesty in his country. That's what he's talking about. You got the Attorney General, you got the president of both countries acknowledging that there's corruption, and let's get it fixed up. And it leads you back to this whole question of the Democrats wanting to impeach President Trump for these amorphous abuse of power issues, these amorphous abuse of Congress or issues, obstruction of Congress. It's just bizarre. So Hunter Biden is placed on the board of Burisma in 2014. Joe Biden calls for the removal of the chief prosecutor, Victor Shokin, in 2016. In the meantime, evidence is clear that Burisma's company paid about $3.4 million to a company called Rosemont Seneca Boher, the company of Hunter and his partner Archer. That is really intriguing. The investigations surrounding Burisma's stop and the Burisma's reputation in Ukraine is low, and it was dubious even before this impeachment inquiry raised it to new attention. Now let's face it. According to Ukrainian sources, Burisma is not on everybody's front burner in the Ukraine, but it is here because we were providing hundreds of millions of dollars to the Ukraine in foreign aid. And this president said, we need to stop corruption. He mentioned specifically the corruption that he had heard about. Is that impeachable? No. It's asking for an investigation to get to the bottom of it because you do not get immunity just because your father is running for a public office, just because anyone related to you is running for public office. And I will tell you, this president has done a remarkable job in spite of 3 years of constant harassment by the Democrats of this body and the media on the left of this country. We have a great economy. He's trying to bring order to the border. We have more people working than ever before. This president has restored the military and actually prestige around the world. There are no more apology tours on the foreign policy side that we saw in the previous administration. He has really worked to make America's esteem and greatness reprise.
Gentlemen, the gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Cicilline, what purposes?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
You are recognized.
I want to just begin very quickly and respond to the gentleman from Ohio's lamenting about the productivity of this Congress, and remind my friends on the other side of the aisle and the American people that we have passed nearly 400 pieces of legislation since Democrats took the majority. 275 of those bills are bipartisan. They range in legislation to drive down the costs of prescription drugs, to protect coverage for pre-existing conditions, to provide equal pay for equal work, to raise the minimum wage for 33 million Americans, the biggest anti-corruption bill since Watergate, H.R. 1, legislation to restore net neutrality, to respond to the climate crisis, universal background checks, and we recently completed negotiations on the new trade deal. So the list is exhaustive. Sadly, 80% of those bills are lying on Mitch McConnell's desk awaiting action. So I urge my colleagues, maybe instead of trying to mischaracterize what is one of the most productive Congresses in modern history, we ought to assert some energy in persuading Mitch McConnell to do his job and bring those bills to the floor. Now let's get back to the facts of this impeachment hearing. First and foremost, there's been this effort to really confuse what this is about and what this impeachment is about. It is about the President of the United States using the power of his office to smear a political opponent, to drag a foreign power into our elections, to corrupt the elections, and leverage hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money to accomplish that objective. So this amendment would like to wish away the motive of the president to engage in this corrupt scheme, but you can't wish it away, you can't amend it away. The facts are the facts. The allegations that we're talking about here originated in 2015. And that's according to the Minority Report as well. And in 2017 and 2018, foreign assistance was provided by Ukraine. What happened in 2019? What changed? The president is losing in a national poll by double digits to Joe Biden. We also, so those are the facts. Third, multiple witnesses, Trump administration officials, testified that Vice President Biden did nothing wrong, including Mr. Kent, Ambassador Yovanovitch, Mr. Holmes, Ambassador Volker. Vice President Biden's firing of the prior prosecutor was done in accordance with official U.S. policy. It was approved by the Justice Department. It was the policy of the United States. It was supported by the European Union and many countries throughout Europe, and a bipartisan coalition in Congress. This was a corrupt prosecutor. It was official U.S. policy that the Vice President was executing. By contrast, what we have in this case, the basis of this impeachment proceeding, is exactly the opposite. What President Trump was doing was not official U.S. policy, and all the witnesses confirmed that. It was not done through the Justice Department, and it was done against the advice of all of his advisors. And so that's what's very different about what we're confronting today. And this was work which was not done by the apparatus of the State Department. This is an effort that was led by the president's personal attorney, Rudolph Giuliani. This scheme was led by this whole apparatus outside the State Department. So let's not confuse these two things. Facts matter, the truth matters. You cannot continue just to make assertions when the record is completely the opposite. And I'd like to yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell.
I thank the gentleman. If President Trump and my Republican colleagues were so interested in rooting out corruption in Ukraine, there was so much they could do that they never did. My Republican colleagues for many years were in the majority. For many years, the vice president's son was on this board. They never investigated this. Their concern only came about once Vice President Biden became President Trump's chief political opponent. On April 21 of this year, President Trump called President Zelensky to congratulate him. In his talking points, President Trump was told to bring up rooting out corruption in Ukraine. President Trump never did it, but the White House, in their talking points, lied to the American people and said the president had. July 25, again, National Security Council members worked really hard to tell the president, impress upon the Ukrainian president he needs to root out corruption in his country. The president never brings up corruption. If the president wanted to investigate any individual U.S. citizen, there's a formal process we go through. The president never asked the Attorney General to do this. The president was never interested in fighting corruption in Ukraine. He was only interested in weaponizing corruption in Ukraine for his own personal benefit, and that's why we must hold him accountable for an abuse of power. And I yield
Mr.
back.
Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize the gentleman for a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd ask that this article dated February 12th, 2019, just 2 weeks before the call to Mr. President Zelensky, entitled "Trump asked top political advisors whether he should worry about running against Joe Biden."
Without objection. It is now, there are votes on the floor. A number of votes on the floor. The committee will stand in recess until after the votes. Please reconvene immediately after the votes. The committee stands in recess.